All right, welcome everyone to the January 18th meeting of the Barrington Planning Board. Tonight in attendance, we have Andy Melnikas, Ron Allard, myself, James Jennison, Andy Knapp. Joining us remotely, we have Jeff Brand and Steve Diamond. Steve there? Steve's oh, I'm sorry, no Steve. Oh, yes. Scratch that. We also have Code Enforcement Officer John Huckins, Land Use Administrative Assistant Barbara Irvine, Town Administrator Connor MacGyver, and joining us remotely is our Planning Consultant Carol Ogilvy. First on the agenda is minutes review from January 4th. Any questions, comments, corrections?
Make a motion to approve.
Jeff, you good?
Yes, and I second.
Motion by Andy Knapp, seconded by Jeff Brand. Andy M. Ron Allard. Andy Knapp.
Aye.
Jeff Brand.
Brand, aye.
James Jennison, aye. Minutes approved as written.
Why you always gotta invade my space like this?
I need it much, it's nice. Next up, we have 270-2 and 270-49-GR-21, sub parents 11, Anthony Serra. Request by applicant Sal Raganese to construct an 11 lot conservation subdivision. Close with Geyer.
Good evening. Once again, my name is Barry Geyer. I'm with Jones Beach Engineers for the applicant. Since our last meeting, as you said, the intent of this project is to construct an 11 lot conservation subdivision, a approximately 690 foot Cul-De-Sac. Since the last meeting, the applicant has been working with the town's review engineer, CMA, to address the drainage issues. We have resolved issues with CMA. The board should have received a sign-off letter from CMA. And with that, I think we have addressed all the issues. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much.
You guys enjoyed the meeting, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. For the record, Steve Diamond is with us. Steve, we are on number 2, and Mr. Guy's here. We're ready to field questions from the board. Anybody has questions?
Essentially, the open spaces.
I believe, and it's going off my prior, I don't have this in front of me for that, but we had discussed this issue. It is over 50% of the open space, but the required have more than sufficient amount of open space that is upland that is required. So at the prior meeting, we discussed that better to protect the environmentally sensitive areas rather than putting those wetland areas into a lot, which then it's harder to police. I don't remember if you were at that meeting, if you remember that discussion. So we were able to actually meet the requirement of 50% of the open space be upland, 50% be wetland. But as we showed the board previously, that it's more environmentally protective to put additional area into the open space, additional wetland into the open space rather.
Is there a waiver?
You guys
That's what
said the planning board could grant more or less. I actually put in the draft notice of decision, additional open space was allowed without meeting the 50%, 6.2.2 parentheses, because that was one that we changed in because they met 50% of what was required. They just wanted to give extra and the board said they were good with it. So I did put it.
So it wasn't a required waiver, but at the discretion of the board.
Discretion of the board, correct. But I did note it so that it could go on plan. So when the
Next person,
We heard your view, actually changing, accommodate that. But I'm looking at 6.2.2-3. Says shall not constitute more than 50%.
I think if you keep reading that,
Discretion to the board on the amount.
Okay, so there's any way with what we talked about. We have a rendering and a lighting plan.
There's no proposed lighting for the cul-de-sac, and typically you don't get it from the houses.
This is a subdivision, it's not a site review.
Right.
The only reason I'm doing rendering is, the issue would be 4, the limit is 2.5 stories here. Only on the basement and 2 floors.
Not on a residential subdivision.
Well, those are also, I mean, there is a height limit, but that's at the building permit stage. That,
Right, but general residential,
2.5 stories is. for the residential.
in your, say 2.5 right in the plans.
I think you have a max building height of 30.
Which is in the town zone.
Right. 2.5 stories is,
No, that's for the multifamily housing and site.
Jeff?
All right. With respect to follow up on Mr. Allen's question, so when you have a conservation subdivision, the open space, we discussed, you're right that we discussed it before. Do we have the documents now? Because the planning board has to actually approve the uses for the open space per the regulations. So do we have the documents now?
I don't believe the homeowners association documents have been submitted. Not yet.
Okay. With respect to, you said that you were getting a final sign-off letter. Now, the last letter that we have from CMA is dated January 14th, last Friday. In that, they had looked at your revised plans, how you addressed their previous comments, and there were a couple of things that appeared to still be unresolved. One of those that they had in their earlier comment had said that there was an issue with, they were worried about unequal flow between the different swales. It sounds like that got resolved by putting a level spreader lined with fabric and riprap. Is that true?
That is correct.
Okay. You also, there was an issue with the bottom of the level of the detention pond relative to the water table, and it appears you fixed that also. You modified that to reflect the correct elevations for the pond bottom and outlet pipe. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we actually have a letter back dated today from CMA that we've addressed all the issues they had.
All right. So then what was there were 2 open issues they still had. One had to do with the flow depth in the swales is less than 4 inches as required, and you might provide a stage discharge table as a backup, although a flow depth of 2.4 is satisfactory. Has that been resolved?
Yes, sir.
And how was that resolved?
We expanded the calculations, and the expanded calculations showed that the hydraulic residence time was 10 minutes, and the which is part.
All right. Mr. Straub, I see you were there. So all the issues now have been satisfied to CMA's satisfaction?
Yes, thanks. We had one last go around with Barry and his firm, and they modified the calculations and clarified calculations on Friday. And we turned around a review letter yesterday or this morning. So there's actually a 4th letter, which has a positive write-off on all these issues.
Okay, appreciate that. A couple of nits on the plans. On sheet C1A, you've got a detail A. I'm not sure why the detail's necessary, but you don't on the plan itself point out and say see detail A. There's no marker there to tell you to see the detail. So I don't know why that is. And like I said, I'm not even sure why it's there, because you can see what's in the detail on the plan. It's up in the northeast corner of the lot where it borders Meadowbrook. And another nit is that there was a previous comment made by the planning office that the sign-off blocks for the town aren't supposed to have any lines in it, and I see the lines are still there in the sign-off block. I may have another question, but that's it for now.
Yeah, we wouldn't have any issue resolving those issues.
Well, while we're talking about seasonal high water level, to what degree are the basements, and I think you said there were some basements in these structures, are they below the high water level?
Yeah, I can't comment on that because we don't have plans that they're, I mean, we have a subdivision, so we don't have plans to build a house. We show a house to show a representative house that could fit on the site. So we don't have the elevations of the houses set, nor do we have the actual house plan itself. So these could be houses with basements, without basements, set above, high enough that there is, the water or the basement is above the seasonal high, or, it's as a subdivision stage, you can't answer that question.
Okay, I was just a little surprised how close the seasonal high water mark was.
Typical on a house when it comes to me for a building permit, the bed of the septic design has to be 4 feet above the seasonal high water table. So that's why you see so many houses like a drive under garage, and you see the hill in the front of the house where the septic is. And basically they got a frost wall and it's put in at grade, so it's above that water table that was existing before all that other fill was brought in. Sometimes you got real good lots where they dig down, but most lots, they don't dig holes. That's the best way to
Got it.
So get somebody that's
Yeah, these, I mean, they're 20, that's typical around here.
Jeff, you got follow-ups?
No, not at this time.
The only question I had was on one of the plans, but he answered that as he was answering Steve's questions.
Hearing none, we'll open public comment. At this time, is anybody out there joining us? Star 6 to unmute. We'll click the icon to unmute your microphone if you have a question. Anybody in the audience, I'd like to come up and ask a question.
Participating virtually on the Teams program, you can raise your hand or enter a comment in the chat feature. Or if you're on your phone, you can press star 6 to unmute yourself. Good job, Chair. No.
Seeing
See anything on this end, Mr. Chair?
Thank you.
Barbara Locke just raised her hand.
Oh, Ms. Locke.
You have to unmute yourself. Icon typically at the center of the screen.
Fine through it.
Can't unmute you. Privacy. You could, if you're in the Teams program, you can enter a comment in the chat feature while you try to get your microphone working.
Were you able to hear me?
Yes.
Now we can. There we go.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I wasn't able to join the meeting when it first started, so I don't know if anyone addressed my concern about beavers damming up Caldwell Brook.
No, and I don't know it's within the scope of us to manage that waterway. They're not doing proposing any construction down in the brook area, so I feel that one's up to nature, unfortunately. And
Or DES. Fish and game, really, not
yeah,
DES.
fishing game would be an option. John, sorry.
Fishing game many years ago stopped mitigating beaver damage.
Yeah, and I would say, I don't know from an environmental standard what their stance is. John, do you ever run into beavers issues?
That's a private issue. It's not a town regulation thing. There is some areas if they're doing damage that they can take out. There's other places where, for conservation reasons, they have them in there to keep some hydrology thing, but that's regulated by the state, not by the town. It's nothing to
Well,
do
in
with
the town is unfortunately, like a lot of municipalities in the state, very much in the beaver business because for the same reasons that you're concerned about beavers threatening the town's infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. And in instances where we can, the town hires a licensed trapper to mitigate the beaver risk to town's infrastructure. But a lot of times that requires, if the town doesn't own the property, but obviously at a cost. And so it's even with the town, it's a private issue that the town can't go in and mitigate easily without the cooperation of landowners.
Longshores Association hired someone in last year to do beaver control because it brought up their water table so much that some of their waterfront land was disappearing and up close to the houses.
Ms. Locke, I would say if you recognize a problem with the beavers in the future that you'd like addressed, certainly reach out to the town. They can see if they would be interested in involvement, and then going to the state level to see if, after that, to see if they would help you out in that, especially if it's on your property, I guess. And if the beaver dam is off your property but affecting yours, again, the same course of action, I would say, would be reaching out to the town first and then the state beyond that.
So I appreciate your suggestions, but I've been listening and reading this plan for drainage, and it's very extensive, and there's talk about whether houses would have basements that had to be above the high water, high water mark, and where Caldwell Brook it is a natural area for beaver to dam, would also affect this development and the wetlands by raising the water table.
And again, from an environmental standpoint, like John mentioned, sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. So it's a case by case situation, whether you may not like them or you may, and the neighbor does or does not, and affects them differently, and take it each case by case where we don't have the jurisdiction to mandate that anybody monitors beaver activity in that brook behind there. But
Especially where it's off the property.
sorry, couldn't be more help.
Would the Conservation Commission have any responsibility for this?
I wouldn't say a responsibility, but maybe a resource to reach out to if they have, future issues. Someone there might have information on who to contact.
Especially if they've had past history in the town that they've been involved with, they might know who to contact.
So I might, Mr. Chair,
Just for the sake of being able to take people out.
if she recognizes an issue, just contact the homeowners association and they probably, will applicant will definitely look into it, but once he's out of the project, contact the homeowners association. And I'm sure they would rather deal with it than have issues with flooding on the property.
Did you hear that, Ms. Locke?
Yes, I did, and.
Okay. Yeah, and so it'll be a
my
little bit
property
before the,
would be- My
me?
property would be impacted much greater than their property. That's
so
already
is,
established.
once that homeowners association is established, that would be another, course of action to talk to them first, see if they'll take care of it on their dime especially, and then branching out from there.
Well, if there's nothing, owners association, rules that
Yeah.
basically.
We can't write it, we
they
can't,
can
require- we can't require them to write a rule that if beaver dam up beyond where they're doing any work, flood your house, that's an act of God almost, it's not.
Sorry, we're not more help in that area. Do you have any other questions that we may be able to address?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else? None, we'll close public comment. Any more questions from the board?
Well, I don't have a question for the applicant. It's, per se, he already answered the question, which is we don't have the documents that are covering the open area. And so 632 of the zoning ordinance requires a site inventory and conceptual development plan be submitted with the application to be approved by the board, which addresses what are the uses going to be. Now, I know this is going to be undeveloped. I assume it's going to be undeveloped. We haven't heard different. But I you know, that needs to be, I believe, directly addressed prior to approval.
That was addressed in the very first meeting when you guys approved the conceptual plan. It was actually part of the minutes that was done, and
Is that where we discussed the percentage of open area?
yeah, you discussed that, and you also discussed a number of residential uses that would be allowed because of that conceptual plan.
Okay.
They needed to do all that in that first meeting so they could go forward with the
All
conservation.
right. Well, that was, okay. Well, that was a long time ago. It was,
Yeah, it was 3 months ago or 4 months ago.
At least.
yeah.
Are you more specific saying, is it the area open to the public or just to the homeowners? Is that what you're referring to, Jeff?
Well, that was part of that discussion, I remember.
It was going to be, it's non-buildable, and they weren't, it was going to be all the homeowners in the subdivision has the right to use the open space, but they weren't interested in allowing public use. I know, the reason why I know so much is I did the draft notice and I went back and looked at all the past minutes because it was so long so that I could do the draft notice. Part of what I got to do today, along with catching up from being off yesterday.
All right.
So one area that Mark Morrow had raised was he still had concerns over the intersection, the three-way intersection on that. And I wanted to know if you folks had gone back to address the single point stop sign that was.
So we addressed that with the board at, I think, our last meeting, and the board decided they wanted a three-way stop sign.
Yeah, I remember, and they showed those three options.
Right. And that's reflected on.
We kind of recommended one option.
Right, it was just reflected in Mark's draft comment that hadn't changed, so when I reread it earlier today, I wanted to make sure that.
No, there's three on the plan.
it
Three-way
was
stop.
addressed.
Yeah, the stuff that was in there originally, I didn't take out. I just tried to add the new stuff to it. So with the staff comments, I left
Yeah,
it in there so everybody would remember what was talked about.
I think that was a previous comment from Mark Monroe. That was an earlier round.
Correct.
Right, I just thought when I reread it earlier today, his comment, it noted that per my prior comment, this still hadn't changed or something to that effect.
But I think it was before it came in. The
Okay,
change that you guys discussed at that last meeting when you discussed that, the arrangement of that.
Yeah, we addressed it at the meeting that they needed to address it. They came in with actually proposed what was it, 2 or 3 different proposals as to how to resolve that. And we selected the one that we thought was best, which was 3-way stop.
Okay, I just wanted to, like I said, I read it and.
Yeah, they actually had a memorandum they got from a Stephen Pernaugh. And, we evaluated that and the board selected the 3-way stop option.
Yep.
But at Jeff's previous point, we usually do have a homeowners agreement, don't we, to have the lawyer look
Yeah,
at?
that should be, I missed it. We should be added to the, it's a decision that you would want that.
That would be a condition of approval or
Yep.
Or a reason to have a meeting.
So you can make it a subject of that, or you want to see it and have it reviewed before you give your final approval. I guess you have that.
yeah, I believe we ought to see it before we sign off on the plans.
What's the best way to do that? If we do it at a meeting, we have to notice it and.
You would have to hold another meeting. What if you guys?
But Jeff, if the lawyer's okay with it, why would we want to look at it?
Well, I'm just saying, we don't necessarily. It would be, it gets submitted, the lawyer looks at it, any issues are resolved, and as long as the lawyer's good with it, I'm just saying that ought to be a precondition to sign the plan. It doesn't mean it has to come back to the board again.
That's typically how it's been done in the
Mission
past.
precedent, yeah.
But that would typically be an area, the reason we would review it is because if there are other items that you wanted to make sure are captured in that, or if the folks that now live around this conservation subdivision had concerns, that's one way to make sure the open space is actively addressed in that. Similarly to how we did not that it was a condition precedent, but how we did the campground where they came back in with here are rules of operation and everything else, and we provided some feedback as to certain hours, number of boats that could be along the water. You would do the same thing with this to say, hey, here's some things we want to make sure are captured in there.
Well, I guess
They're saying they're doing nothing in there, but does that mean somebody's goes out and is camping in the uplands area or something? Like you want to make sure all of that is.
Right, we usually look at it and say if they're cleaning or mowing the
Right.
swales or cleaning the ditches,
Well, I'm glad you,
that's not in the open space. That's in your room.
No, I'm
Yeah.
saying, but any of that would be in the,
Be in the homeowner thing.
right.
right, and I'm
We
glad
have-
you brought that up, Jamie, because that was the note I was looking for. I was going to ask that exact question. Where's the maintenance plan for the drainage system?
We provided I don't have it with me, but we provide a operation and maintenance manual that was reviewed by CMA.
Okay.
Speaking of that, actually,
Does that
I'm
get
looking at
tied in? Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
So to Barbara's, the concerned abutters question, I don't know if she's still with us, but it says here, the future owners and assigns are responsible to perform the maintenance obligations or hire a professional engineer to review the site on an annual basis for maintenance and certification of the stormwater system. So it's not just that the property owners would obviously want to do something if their property was flooded because of a beaver, but they're required on an annual basis to maintain their stormwater system. And if it were underwater, they would have to do that. That's all.
Stormwater system is the system about the roadway and stuff like that. It's not about the wetlands that are way out behind the subdivision. That's two different things.
I mean, I'm just saying if the water was so high that it got there, but anyway, just
Yeah,
thought it might reassure Barbara a little
That
bit.
makes sense.
That was actually the point I wanted to raise is in the homeowners association, it needs to make sure that it addresses the proper management of that swales because I guess I don't know if I'll say historically, what I have seen in numerous instances are those swales are not maintained to the specification of a drainage swale, and they end up getting compacted. They get mowed far too short, and then they end up not functioning the way they're designed to function.
Goes on for a lot of years and they put a lot of sand on the road. It can affect them.
They fill it. They fill in.
So the question is, does the board want to see the agreement before we make a final approval? Or do we want to rely solely on attorney and staff?
Staff know what we look for. I don't think there's anything unusual about this one. I'm okay with this.
And the maintenance thing's already been addressed as part of that other process that's
We
already.
can make sure that the O&M is referenced in the HOA.
Please.
So you're fine with
Yeah, as long as they make sure that those items are referenced in the HOA. I'm okay
Jeff
with
and
it.
Steve? Are you okay with proceeding that way? Steve, some thumbs up.
Steve.
Yeah, I'm okay.
So we gotta add that to.
The condition, the particular, which 1, 2, or at the bottom of number 8, which one would be appropriate?
Suppose you can make it a number 8.
Well,
Or you could put it as an F under that number 1. The F under.
That, I couldn't guarantee that.
Well, we currently have a 1, 2, and then another number 1, and a 6 and a 7. I mean, we could add a 3, right?
You can tell I cut and pasted.
While we're looking at it, if you don't mind, the conditions precedent, item 1D, the DES wetland number. So we don't have any wetland impact, so we won't be obtaining a wetland permit.
Oh, you managed to keep it all just in the buffer, didn't you?
Correct.
Oh, that's right. So I was thinking you went into the buffer.
Scratching.
And E, we're under 100,000, so we won't be obtaining an alteration of terrain permit either. And if I'm on one hashtag or 1 star, the monument, survey monumentation, suggestion that it be put as a condition of sale of a lot instead of condition precedent. The issue we have is because we are installing a road, the lot bounds have to go at the corners of the lots. So, and if it's a condition precedent, those will be installed prior to the construction of the road. And that means they're going to get disturbed.
9 times out of 10, that's bonded as part of the road work.
Right. So if it's a condition precedent, we have to go install it before as part of the approval.
So make it a subsequent condition.
Right. If we can make it a substitute, we don't have, obviously it has to be done, but if it's not a condition precedent, then I can do it after construction so that we can actually put them in once and not have to do it.
So why don't we just move that to a number 2 under general and subsequent conditions?
Thank you. Oh, all the other ones look standard.
If there's, do you have any questions for the board before I read this?
Well,
You're
so to be clear, so under conditions precedent, we're scratching 1B and 1E, correct?
D and E.
D and E.
D
We
and
need
E.
a wetland scientist stamp.
Yeah, you still need that.
Okay, so delta and echo.
And then the one with the hashtag is gonna go.
The one the hashtag's going down is number 2 under general and subsequent conditions. And we talked about adding, the other one was we were going to add a 3 to
HOA.
about the HOA documents will be submitted to the town for review.
And in that will be included the care and maintenance of the drainage system.
Okay, so HOA documents will be submitted to the town to include maintenance of the drainage system.
It's gonna reference, right? It's gonna reference it. It's how you're gonna,
Reference the stormwater operation and maintenance manual.
and you want the town's attorney to review it too, correct?
The HOA doc, not the O&M has been reviewed
It's already
by
been-
CMA.
Right. After the town's attorneys review that, it's the precedent conditions so that plans can be signed.
Yeah,
What we want, John, is a lawyer to make sure that the responsibilities in the HOA document.
Right, so they'll understand the legal. It's just that before Jamie comes in and signs them, we make sure we get something back from the attorney saying something.
okay, so I just wanted to make sure we understood what the changes were before Jamie started reading here.
Correct me as I read if I stumble. Dear applicant, this is to inform you that the Barrington Planning Board at its January 18th, 2022 meeting conditionally approved your application referenced above. All of the precedent conditions below must be met by the applicant at the expense of the applicant prior to the plans being certified by the planning board. Certification of the plans is required prior to the commencement of any site work or recording of any plans. Once these precedent conditions are met and the plans are certified, the approval is considered final. Please note, if all of the precedent conditions are not met within 6 calendar months to the day, by July 18th, 2022, the board's approval will be considered to have lapsed unless a mutually agreed upon extension has been granted by the board. Reference 8.2.3 of the Town of Barrington Subdivision Regulation. Conditions precedent. 1, add the owner's signature to the final plan. Add the wetland scientist stamp and signature to the final plan. Add state subdivision approval number to the plan. No, B stays, getting D and E. Number 2, add the following plan notes. The following items were granted as part of this application. 9.6 special permit was granted. Additional open space was allowed without meeting the 50% requirements of 6.2.2 parents 3. Variance was granted for 6.2.6 perimeter buffer for existing house. Number 3, HOA documents to be approved by town attorney to and to reference maintenance operating the SOMM, stormwater operation maintenance manual. Number 6, and correct the numbering of.
We'll make that 4.
All right, we'll make that 4. Any outstanding fees shall be paid to the town. Please provide a check for $25 made out to the Stratford County Registry of Deeds to cover the LCHIP fee. New number 5, final drawings, 5 sets of black line plus 1 set of 11 by 17 final approved plans must be on file with the town. Each individual sheet and every set of the drawings must be stamped and signed by the land surveyor, engineer, or architect responsible for the plans. Note, if there are significant changes to be made to the plans as specified above, 1 full-size check print must be sent to the land use office for review prior to producing these final drawings. General and subsequent conditions. 1, current use subject property or a portion of it is presently in current use. The applicant must provide the Town of Barrington Assessing Department current use map and other items needed to assure requirements of RSA 79A and the New Hampshire Department of Revenue Administration rules are satisfied. Number 2, proper and complete survey monumentation shall be installed on the property as a condition. Not a final approval. Iron pins, pipe or rod are to be placed at all property line corners and angles, at all points of curvature and points of tangency. Monuments for the lot being developed shall be placed no more than 300 feet apart in any straight line. The applicant shall certify in writing that the bounds and pins have been installed according to the submitted plan. Reference 8.8 of the Town of Barrington Subdivision Regulations. All right, that's it. Comments? The motion is in order.
Make a motion, oh, go ahead, no, take it away, Andy. Just gonna say, I'll make a motion to approve 270-2-3_273-49-GR-21 subparents 11.
I
Including,
second.
as I say, including all general and precedent conditions as noted.
Motion by Andy Knapp, second by Jeff Brand. Andy M.
Andy, am I?
Ron Allard.
Now,
Andy Knapp.
Aye.
Jeff Brand.
Brian, aye.
Steve Diamond.
Diamond eye.
James Jennison, aye. All in favor? Good luck. Thank you very much. Moving on to number 3, 236-4-GR-20-R, Sunset Rock LLC. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name's Ari Pollock. I'm with the Gallagher firm in Concord. I'm here tonight again for Sunset Rock LLC. Joining me in the gallery is Eric Stevenson of Brock's Industries, and to my right is Mike Wright of Respect. We're here tonight to conclude the conversation we had on January 4th, 2022, relating to CMA's peer review recommendations and what we've worked on interim, which is a draft set of conditions of approval. Following the last discussion, on behalf of the applicant, we put together and sent a set of proposed conditions to CMA. We sent a copy to town staff. That was on January 6th, 2 days after the prior meeting. CMA reviewed what we had provided and responded the next day with some suggested revisions. And we're able to come before you and accept all of those suggested revisions with one exception. The remaining item relates to the language of proposed condition 5. I don't know if you all have it in front of you. If you don't, I have copies. There are copies on the table here as well. But essentially, the one exception comes down to the language of proposed condition 5 and whether it should apply to the expansion area, which is lot 4, a parcel containing 5.5 acres, which is the subject and purpose of the application we've submitted, or instead whether it should apply not only to the expansion area, but to the entirety of the quarry, which would be over 80 acres. Condition 5 relates to the creation of a bedrock water level monitoring and reporting plan before excavation can proceed below 120 feet above. It's kind of a weird way to say it, but below 120 feet above would be the trigger for creating the plan. The plan comes out of CMA's peer review memo dated December 20th of 2021, which we received ahead of the last meeting and which we reviewed with the board at the last meeting. Frankly, the memo is ambiguous as to whether or not that suggestion should apply to the existing quarry or just the expansion area. It's our position that it should and needs to apply only to the expansion area. At present, and again, we discussed this at the last meeting, the issue of depth is regulated by our existing alteration of terrain permit by a condition that says if and when groundwater dewatering from the excavation is required, you should then have a plan in place to regulate. We find that approach, as was approved by the state decades ago, to be sufficient for the existing area. It's been operated safely for all that time. We have not encountered groundwater, haven't triggered the need for that plan. But meanwhile, the water volumes in the surrounding wells have not been affected or been, starved for flow either. CMA's revision clarifies that they think the condition should apply to the entirety of the excavation, both current and proposed. And our version says, or we would ask that it be limited just to activities on number 4. And so, for example, in the CMA version, which has a number 3 in the corner, I'm looking at the same, In number 5, wait a minute, this must be a submission that was made by the city of Dover. So maybe there's another version of this somewhere. But anyway, the CMA version, and I have copies if it's helpful. It should say, or in the applicant's opinion, it should say, prior to any excavation activities on lot 4 proceeding below the elevation of 120 feet above sea level. Why is this important to us? Well, the expansion gets us closer to the municipal wells. We appreciate the need to be ahead of groundwater interception as we get closer, but we think frankly that the alteration of terrain language adequately protects the existing area. The current excavation area, the 80 acres that we're currently excavating on, is already at or near 120 feet above sea level. And so if we were to agree to spread that condition both from the expansion area to the entirety of the quarry, we'd essentially have a red light right now. Stop, don't do any more. You may or may not be right on that 120, and spend the time, which could be a significant amount of time, to create the monitoring plan, pose it, have it peer reviewed, have it state and local be coordinated with DES, and then ask for approval of that plan. All the while we would essentially have a stop sign in front of us, which I don't think is anyone's intention. It's really just a glitch of the wording that somebody is saying stop right now. We just can't take the risk, frankly, of interrupting the excavation on 80 acres to permit 5. It's the tail wagging the dog in our view. And so instead we're asking that the excavation, existing excavation, I should be clear, remain subject to the alteration of terrain language, and that the 5 acres, where we're again getting closer to that well, be subject to it's an arbitrary depth, a conservative arbitrary number, which we have no issue with relative to the expansion area of that 120 feet. Now, CMA claims in its email dated January 11th, which you may have, but anyway, if you don't, I can summarize quickly, and Bill's on the line, I know, that the failure to spread the condition would leave no adequate or no added protection. It's just not the case. The alteration of terrain already discusses the interception of groundwater. And sure enough, we're going to need to go in for an alteration of terrain permit for this expansion area, and whatever's on the state's mind in regulating that area would certainly be part of our obligations as well. I'd also just want to point out for you that conditions 4 and 6, those as proposed would also apply to both the existing and the expansion area, but we've accepted those conditions as applying in both places. Those deal with water quality monitoring and aquifer recharge monitoring. Again, part of the conversation from the last time we were here, and certainly makes good scientific sense to keep an eye on what's in that water and whether or not it's being affected by our operations. We would, if the condition were imposed the way CMA recommends, honestly, we'd have a big decision to make about whether we have to appeal the spreading of that condition to the existing area, whether we withdraw the application, try to file something new and different related only to lot 4. And if we did that, the consequence, of course, would be to have a setback applied to both sides of the common boundary between our existing area and the expansion area. It'd look like a ridgeback. Nobody wants that. That doesn't make any sense. It's going to be right in the way of future uses of this land area. And so we're asking you to essentially stand with what's already been applied at the existing area for a long, long time, but go ahead and impose that condition on the expansion area.
Second, if you guys look at the pink piece of paper that came from Johnny, the question was asked. So you guys, this is attorney-client, but it's that question is basically answered from the attorney's point of view to how you have to apply that moving forward. I didn't mean to cut you off. Make it quicker.
I'd love to see what you read.
What document are they looking at?
You got it
John?
as part of your copy. It was an email sent to you guys earlier today. Oh,
Yeah, so I talked to the town's attorney today, and the town's attorney agrees with Pollock, in that the town's attorney doesn't believe that the planning board has the authority to extend conditions such as that.
I couldn't hear what you're saying, Connor.
The town's attorney agrees that the town does not have the authority, the planning board does not have the authority to impose restrictions that indicate number 5 previously approved project. Previously approved. I think it's important to include on the record that the town's engineer, not from a legal standpoint, but from a technical standpoint, believes it would be best practice and to accomplish the goals that the planning board has talked about is what would be best for the use. But the town's attorney from a legal standpoint does not believe that to impose that restriction on something already by the existing
It's already vested and approved from a previous.
So just to be clear on that point, we don't have an issue spreading the condition from water quality monitoring as stated in conditions 4 and 6. We would essentially waive that or accept it, or whatever language you want to consider. But it is a problem for us on number 5, and we've got to stand firm. So again, when you read number 5, our suggested language would not be to strike activities on lot 4. It would say prior to any excavation activities on lot 4 proceeding below the elevation of 120 feet above sea level. We would resurrect that deletion. And that's it. I appreciate you listening.
Thank you. Questions from the board?
Do you have a copy, Steve, of a copy of that language, proposed language?
Our proposed, they do. And it is identical with the exception of what I just read to you.
Someone
I-
that package.
But we've strike through.
Strike. Don't.
I had trouble figuring out one version from I hear.
The one that's got the red and the strike through was something Dover sent. They.
Mine's got all of that. Yeah, one thing.
That's what this EMA. That's.
So we've kind of wrapped ourselves around the axle here with dueling this thing. Just to try and be as clear as I can be, the applicant proposed version has 6 sections. The 7th one is, it was actually deleted by CMA because it got rolled into another condition. So that subject matter is included. The version that's in front of me here labeled as number 3 has a 7 and 8. That's not ours. We don't want that.
Okay.
That helps.
I'm not seeing that document on the public web interface, nor does it appear to be in my email, but I from what I'm hearing, I don't have a problem with it, personally.
Yeah, I didn't see it in my email either.
This is the one.
I was like, who's mixing drinks?
That's the one they should have. Yeah, so you got the one that came from, you should have had the one that came from CMA. Was it Friday, I think? Friday, and then we forwarded it to.
I've got a,
I got 30 minutes here too.
Yeah, and then then Dover sent you one on Friday too. That sent directly to you guys. It didn't go to the news office.
print that one out. That's a different version.
Yeah, it's a
I saw the
different-
one from Dover.
So CMA, if you looked at the one that Dover sent you, it had CMA stuff on it. When you clicked on it, it had the changes that Dover recommended to it. So it was like 2 documents combined together. And it.
Yeah, I just
CMA
opened
sent
that
those
up.
over end of
I
last
just
week.
opened up the attachment to the Dover, and I now see it. Yeah.
Yeah, so then if you click on the little line side, It's got what they recommended for changes, but when you don't, and it was CMA sent over stuff that. No. I think Bill was the one who helped do this, so you can have a conversation with him about it.
So again, just to try to be helpful, maybe I'm not.
I need help.
I just want to be clear that the applicant accepts the CMA version with that one change in condition 5.
My only question about that is you struck 210. Is that relevant?
There is 2.
It was in one version, it says elevation of 120, 210 ASL. In this original, the one you handed out tonight, this is 120 ASL. The 210 a relevant number.
I don't see the 210, but my guess is it was a typo of 100.
So it's a 121. Okay. Yeah, on this one where it's struck through, it says 120, 210. The one that's labeled number 3.
Sorry, I don't.
Backside, number 5.
That was the one Dover. This is the one Dover marked up. The one that.
All right, I'm just wondering if the 210 means.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
Yes.
What he just handed. Right.
Yes, and here's the reason I did that. I was present at a meeting a month or 2 ago, and somebody handed in something just before the meeting, and it was sternly criticized as too late and inappropriate. And I didn't want to be that guy unless I had your permission. That's the only reason I didn't send it by email to the secretary.
So the other thing that I see standing out here is you have the monitoring data changes from, it was originally noted as yearly, and then it goes to biennially.
Yes.
And one thing Dover had noted was they specifically requested semi-annual.
I don't know what the difference is between biennial and semi-annual.
Biennial is every 2 years, semi-annual is twice a year.
So I think we are proposing twice a year.
So it should be biannually, not biennially.
So
Biennially is every other year. Annual
Oh, I
is
took
twice in a year.
I took it as every other year. That's
Yeah.
fine.
So we had yearly, and that we had started with yearly. And then I think, so we didn't do ourselves any favors because we did yearly, May and October. And then somebody, I think it's maybe CMA Bill, changed it to biennially. But I think what you're saying is right, which is biannually. But anyway,
Yes.
we're proposing to do it twice a year.
Okay.
Bill's shaking his head up and down.
Okay, I'm like, I deal with these things all the time, so that
Twice a year.
area.
You live with twice a year.
All right.
Put whatever word you'd like in front of.
And then the next,
Twice a year because I can understand that.
then sump is annually in October.
Yeah.
Every 5 years for the last one.
Yeah.
So the TPH and the VOCs, in the monitoring well 1 and monitoring well 2, it notes every 5 years, age, TPH and VOCs, and then it says all parameters above.
Okay.
Yep.
And I see TPH, but I don't see, I guess VOCs is there in the sumps.
It is, yeah. So
It's there.
again, too many cooks in the kitchen. I think it got where we wanted.
Okay, I'm good. That was the other one, under monitoring well 1 and monitoring well 2, Dover had specifically asked for semi-annually on that one as well. As opposed to every 5 years.
Right, so
And
the applicant and CMA, I think, are lined up every 5 years.
I guess I wanted some of Bill's feedback on that.
Hi, this is Bill Straub. Those 2 wells are not terribly important in my opinion. Other wells that will be placed in the future will be of more importance than the location of those 2 particularly. So 5 years is fine with me.
Okay, and because they're monitoring the sumps, do you feel you'd have a more representative sample of it coming out of the sumps as opposed to the monitoring wells?
Well, there's 2 different things. The monitoring wells that were placed years ago they're not terribly useful in monitoring the groundwater quality from the excavation. The sump is a different matter. That's surface water primarily being pumped away, and we wanted to have assurances that there wasn't some spill or some other action in the pit area that ends up in the sump, therefore getting pumped up to discharge the groundwater. So it's a different objective for the sump. And we think that the sump should be checked for all reasonable parameters when it's checked.
Right. The reason I was asking is just that I would assume we would see TPH and VOCs out of the sump before we would see the leaching to groundwater monitoring well, which is why it would be more probable to get caught there on a semi-annual monitoring basis than it would on a monitoring well every 5 years.
Yes, and again, my initial impression is those are not good. Those are not necessarily effective locations for monitoring wells from the site.
Okay, thank you.
Also, the sump is going to collect any kind of a surface spill that,
Yeah,
again,
you'll see it.
anyway, but
Yeah,
that's where you'd find them done by it.
Just to go back and just so that I understand.
Jeff, sorry,
I'll speak up so you
Connor
can
was
hear me.
talking, he couldn't hear him.
The document with the yellow highlight is the same as the January 7th CMA document for the last given the town's engineer, with the exception of that yellow highlight. And so, Mr. Straub, just to make sure you understand what the planning board's looking at, the only change in that condition number 5 is an addition of activities on lot 4.
Right.
In proceeding below the elevation of 120, consistent with how the attorney will describe it.
Correct.
And if the planning board is comfortable with that, I'd probably add the map with lot. Make sure you know what.
It is referenced above in the
Oh, is it?
motion. Yeah.
Sure. Jeff, sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I just wanted to ensure that I understood. So the only bone of contention here between CMA and Brock's is essentially when you're going to have to put this this study into place. What we've said is on the expansion, they can do the cuts up above 120 feet, but we want to get the monitoring in place before they go below that, whereas the old permit said if and when you go below it, that's when you would have to institute a study and get approvals. So it's a matter of timing. Is that correct?
It's a little different than that. The original approval that they had, they can go below the 120 unless they hit water according to their alteration of terrain, and they
Okay.
would be able to. It's just the new area would be triggered by the 120, not the old area. That's the difference.
Yeah.
I
And
agree.
so they would have to, get in the new area, they would have to put the monitoring study into place prior to going below that level.
Correct.
But there's still a study that's required under the previous permit for the larger pit. It's just,
It's when they hit water by the alteration of terrain.
but
of the
it's
old.
by the water, right?
Right, so if they don't hit water until they get to 100 or to 80, that's when they would have to do it, not necessarily the 120. To meet their alteration of terrain in their old area.
This is Bill Straub. The conversation that we all had in January 4th didn't, in my view, make the distinction between the expansion and the existing pit. And we were talking about the behavior being the same kind of behavior. Now the expansion's closer to the wells, yes, but the elevation and the hydrogeologic impact are essentially the same. So if you go down to the in the existing pit down towards the permitted elevations of 30, whatever it is, you're going to have the same effect as if you go down on that elevation in the expansion. I thought we had understood that we were looking at the whole thing as a big unit, and that was the understanding that I left that meeting with, and that's why we suggested in the our markup January 7 markup of Brox's original set of conditions was to make that distinction. Said, look, if we're going to go below 120 anywhere, we're going to have the potential for the behaviors that could negatively affect the Dover well. So we suggested the draft that we did. And I don't know if you have my email from January 11th last week, but I was reacting or discussing Mr. Pollock's suggested changes, which is explained tonight, and I understand those very well. I guess I just want to make the point that from a technical basis, it seems that that distinction is not important. It may be important from a legal basis, and I understand that. But from a technical basis, the behaviors that we would be looking to protect the regional water resources from would occur whether it's in the expansion or the existing pit. And we had discussed that the AOT permit condition number 6 talks about when there is an effect or when there is a potential for effect. And we talked on January 4th that that's kind of late to be dealing with it, and that would be better to be proactive. So that was our point, and I think it's technically very sound. It may have a legal problem, however. And I think that's the situation that you're in. I would respectfully disagree with Mr. Pollock about one being more important than the other. I think they're equally important, frankly. But legally, there is a distinction, and I understand that.
You're 100% correct. I think the board totally agrees with you, but they still are bound by legal parameters too.
Well, I think that to me, in the existing part we're already permitted for, when they do groundwater dewatering, they have to get approval ahead of time. That, I think, addresses, you're shaking your head, nope, Phil?
Well, they I don't know that the condition 6 was well worded in the AOT permit. It talks about when there's a potential for groundwater dewatering. It's kind of not clear to me what the threshold is that kicks in that condition. And the conditions that we negotiated around 120 were rather clear. That there was an elevation that would govern, and it takes a while to get some of these studies done, a year, 2, something like that. And that ought to be done proactively in front of a situation where it's actually being dewatered. That's a technical rationale for all the cases that we've been bringing in. And frankly, we talked about this applying at 120 so that it did not have to happen up front. The other alternative was that it happened as a condition of this expansion, but no one wants that. It could happen as a condition of the expansion, but Mr. Pollock suggested the possible objections to that. So it's to be straightforward about it. It's not a technical issue that we're dealing with, that you're dealing with. It's more a legal issue that you're dealing with.
Yeah, but it says if groundwater excavation is required, a bedrock level monitoring and reporting plan shall be submitted and approved by the department. That seems to me to indicate that you can't really do the dewatering until you got an approved plan.
The open question, I think, is how do you measure dewatering? How do you know dewatering is happening? There's no way to know. There may not be a way to know.
I have no doubt that the Alteration of Terrain Bureau is going to take a fresh look at that language when we submit our new application and clarify their intentions. And if they don't do it on their own, I have no doubt others will ask that they do so.
I think that's probably true. Yeah.
And we'll deal with that process when and if it happens. But to sign up for a stop sign on an existing excavation area that's been operating year after year for decades, we just can't accept that. And so we do need to draw the legal distinction between what exists and what's proposed. Because of the immediacy of having to stop and wait and plan. And I agree with what Bill was saying, that having everybody weigh in on this plan, having everybody make comment on this plan, get it approved, state and local, coordinate all those efforts. It is a lengthy process. I mean, we've been at this for a long time already, and we haven't even tried to engineer something with that level of detail. We're not afraid of it. We're willing to do it. I appreciate that we can dig down to that level without having the need for that because we'll be away from the water table. But it's important that we separate proposed from existing on this issue.
Any other comments or questions from the board? Open up public comment. If there's anybody that wants to speak, has a question.
If you guys could give up your tables.
Sure.
This is being virtually, you want to make a comment, you can raise your hand or press *6, unmute yourself and speak up. We have comments, Joe's gonna hear first.
Right. Hi there, Mr. Chairman and Board. Gretchen Young, I'm the Environmental Project Manager from the City of Dover, and I really appreciate you listening to us this evening. First of all, I obviously apologize for the email on Thursday or Friday, but you have to recognize that this is hugely important to the City of Dover. It's our largest aquifer. It can provide 60% of the water for our city. It's an absolute necessary resource for us. And so we really need to take seriously both the aquifer recharge, making sure that we have the capacity there, that there's no dewatering of aquifer, and then also the water quality. And then with me here tonight is John Brooks, who is the senior consultant. I don't see him on my computer, but I do see him up there. Who's a senior consultant for Emery and Garrett, and they are experts in the region. They work with a number of communities in the area, and they are our on-call hydraulic hydrogeologists for the City of Dover. And we really asked them to stay engaged in this whole process. I think a number of you met John Brooks at the site walk that happened almost a year ago, and he stayed on board. We did receive, as you know, we received CMA's comments just before the last meeting, and did not have an opportunity to review those ahead of that meeting. And then, of course, we received the language that was being discussed last Monday and weren't able to get a full review to you until last Friday, which is what was the quick turnaround. And I am going to ask him to speak a little bit to his review comments, but before I do, I again want to say, you know, this is not just an abutter and a NIMBY situation. This is, you know, crucial capacity for the whole City of Dover. So, you know, I really hope you allow this to take time, take process. We had talked, you heard the applicant talk about how that level of engineering hasn't happened yet. And that's kind of what our concern is that that level of engineering really hasn't happened yet, that there is some analysis of how the groundwater is going to act, how the rock's going to act, whether there's high yield fractures that we don't know about, whether there's potential for dewatering, all of these things. And, you know, whether it's in the proposed expansion or whether it's in the existing area, you know, is technically, as Mr. Straub said, technically really less important than just looking at this all together and making sure that we protect the resource. I'd also like to say that, you know, we don't want to hinder the application and we don't want to just be a roadblock. We work with Brock's, we use that pit, we use the materials from there. We certainly want to see them continue to operate in the area. So we're not looking to be obstructionists. We just really want to make sure that we're protecting the water quality and water capacity in the area. And then with that, I'm hoping I can open it up to Mr. Brooks to talk a little bit more about the technical review.
Mr. Brooks, unmute yourself.
He was trying.
Oh, yeah.
No, it's the mic with a line through it. You got.
He has the most trouble when
This guy is technically top up.
Can't hear you.
Oh,
Your microphone's still showing as muted.
If you're in a web browser, you have to make sure that your web browser has permission to use your microphone. And if you're on the Teams desktop program, you can click the three dots and go into device settings. Make sure that the microphone of your computer manager is the one that's selected.
There we go.
Sorry. Too many microphones on my web browser. As Gretchen said, thanks for listening to what we have to say tonight. We really appreciate it. As John Storr and Gretchen both said, the city's not trying to be obstructionist, but they have an incredibly valuable resource that they'd like to protect. And as has been discussed, I know I haven't been at all the meetings, but the main concerns are protecting water quality in the aquifer from potential blasting residues, protecting long-term water levels in the event that a high-yield fracture zone is intercepted below the water table. If that really starts draining the aquifer and lowers the water levels in the sand and gravel, it could impact the utilization of the Campbell well and maybe even the Calderwood well, which is a little farther away. And also, one thing that hasn't really been discussed too much is protecting the recharge that's available to the Campbell well. If you look at the cross sections that were provided, the geologic cross sections that were provided by Brock's for their excavation, you can see based on their drilling that the bedrock under the unexcavated area in the proposed excavation area and also the permitted area in the north slope toward the Campbell wells. So precipitation that enters into the sand and gravel at the surface infiltrates down, hits that sloping bedrock surface and feeds into the aquifer that's surrounding the Campbell well. So it helps maintain the water level in that. Well, as they lower down the bedrock, that peak of bedrock that slopes off to the east, if they flatten that surface out, that water will no longer be running toward the Campbell well. And this is all occurring above 120 feet. So as soon as they flatten that surface out, or more likely, I don't know that much about quarrying, but maybe slope it into the quarry so they can collect that water, they're reducing the amount of recharge that goes to the Campbell well. So it's not a question of waiting to 120 feet. There's already some potential impact occurring to water levels and recharge in the aquifer. I think these are things that some of the regulations, the changes we suggested could be worked out. As Mr. Pollard says, there's a lot of work to do, and also Mr. Straub. The one thing that seems to be missing in a lot of their plans is mention of monitoring the sand and gravel aquifer. There's a lot of bedrock wells. There's a lot of water quality in the bedrock. But of course, if these are interrelated hydraulically, then we need to put additional monitoring wells in the sand and gravel aquifer in locations close to the quarrying so that they can access sentry wells. We want to know to start with, is the water level in the bedrock actually higher than what's in the sand and gravel aquifer around the well? Well, that would suggest the water's perched. It's not hydraulically connected at this point. But if you can't establish a baseline up front, then you don't know what happens later on. You need to know what the baseline is now so that when an impact occurs, you can assess what that impact is. How quickly is it occurring? How long is it taking? But if you have water levels, for example, collected every 5 years, you're just taking a little picture of what's going on. Particularly the sand and gravel, we have a monitoring well fairly close to actually the property ground boundary between Brock's and the city. It's on the access road on the northern end of the city property. And we see that oscillating up and down by on the order of 10 feet a year. The water level goes up and down. We just took one water level every month, we would not see that amount of variation. So we would really like to work with Brock's to get some plan going sooner than later, so that we can collect the background data that's needed to assess potential impacts later on, both in the bedrock and the aquifer. And then try to deal with the recharge issue. Maybe if the recharge is being reduced, the other question might be, well, what's going to happen with the groundwater discharge location, what they're pumping out of the quarry? It's our understanding that as they expand the northern area of their permitted quarry over toward the well, that they're going to have to move their groundwater discharge area because that's actually discharging where they're going to excavate. So if we can come to some collaborative location for where the groundwater discharge is going to be moved, so it maximizes potential recharge to the Campbell well in the sand and gravel, that would be a win-win. You know, they'd have a new place to put their discharge, and we would, the city would gain the maximum benefit for additional recharge that they're pumping out of their quarry, and that would include precipitation that used to go to this go to the well, and now maybe it's going into the quarry. So it would help mitigate any potential impact from that. So you know, I know from a legal basis, it sounds like we can't really start this program as soon as possible, like before any work's done, put a plan together, especially in the northern end where they already have that permit. But you know, just wanted to let you know that potential impacts will start occurring to recharge once they start excavating. So I think that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question here of Mr. Brooks? With respect to the comments, I understand your concerns about recharge of the aquifer, and you have suggested that a relocation of the area to which they're discharging. Just a question though, doesn't that increase the potential of a contamination of the aquifer should something go wrong in the quarry?
Yes, that's right, and that's why we suggested much more frequent water quality analyses of the water being pumped from the sump. We thought at least, we were originally thinking quarterly, and decided that we would suggest twice per year, semi-annually, instead of every 2 years, biannually. Because like you're suggesting, they're going to be doing a lot of well, you're not suggesting that, excuse me, they're going to be doing a lot of blasting in those 2 years. And you don't want to wait until 2 years to find out that the water's been contaminated, obviously. So the more frequent water quality analyses from the sump that can be done, the greater the protection will be.
They did agree to biannual. That's what
We changed that.
So I thank you. I wasn't quite clear if we were all thinking semi-annually was twice a year, not twice every other year.
This is Bill Straub again, and I apologize for all this confusion. I meant to write biannually, and I wrote biannually, and I missed that. Semi-annually is correct.
Okay, all right.
Typo on my part.
There will be May and October sampling twice a year.
Yeah, the reason I asked is because in a couple of my former jobs, I had to deal with, on behalf of the government, contamination of water issues. And unfortunately, sampling is great. It'll tell you if you got a problem, but if it does identify a problem, once you contaminate an aquifer, as you know, it's a long-term, ongoing, and often unsolvable issue once it happens.
Right.
Can I just speak to that? Also, there was a recommendation prior to any excavation, a spill prevention plan, ensuring that doesn't happen, that these contaminations don't happen.
A couple of general comments that I have on that. A spill protection plan doesn't actually prevent anything from happening. It just says, here's what we do should it. Here are ways to prevent it. Here's what we'll do should it happen. Here's how we respond to it. So there was that piece. I really struggled with the number 8 item as well, because if we're concerned about the sump water, I for the life of me could not understand why we would want to put that sump water into a position where it would go back and potentially contaminate, be a higher level of probability of it contaminating the town's well supply. usually you try to mitigate those sources and keep everything as far away from it as possible.
And that's exactly my point.
Yeah.
I'll let you. Mr. Brooks?
That's why when I heard win-win, having dealt with these issues in the past, I have some question as to whether that's potentially a win-win, or it could be a lose-lose.
Yeah, let Mr. Brooks
Yeah,
explain.
well, yes, we appreciate your concern. We're also very concerned about it. And part of the management is not just water quality testing, but it's setting up spill prevention programs, defining where you can fuel your trucks, where on the site can that occur, what actions are taken so that if a small spill occurs, then there's an immediate response. The materials are available right on the truck. You're not trying to figure out what to do. There's an immediate response. The other is different types of procedures you can do during blasting to help minimize and prevent, hopefully, the contamination of groundwater by either having a certain time period that you can have your blasting residue on the ground, covering it. So there are different things that could be put into a plan to try. You can never eliminate the potential, the possibility, but to try to minimize it to within a reasonable risk level is what we hope. The other concern, though, is the other option is to take a risk, basically, that potential impacts will occur to the aquifer's recharge and the pumping capacity of the aquifers. So we're trying to find a sweet spot between those two risks that, as I said, is a win-win.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask John, would you mind talking a little bit about the different types of bedrock analysis, the one that CMA suggested versus the seismic refraction versus the electric resistivity?
Yeah, certainly. The seismic refraction surveys, I'm sure you probably have all, you've seen them even happening, but basically there's an explosive source or some type of energy source. You can just pound on the ground on a plate with a hammer, and you're recording the transit time that it takes for the energy to reach the bedrock surface. And then typically you have a series of seismometers and you record the surface of the bedrock. So it's a great way to look at the depth of bedrock and also water tables within sand and gravel. So it would serve that purpose. Electrical resistivity surveys, you're sending a current through the ground through a series of stakes, metal stakes that are in the ground about every 10 meters to 5 meters. And by looking at the current and changes in the resistivity in the subsurface, you can map out the water table, you can map out the depths of bedrock, and you can look at fracture zones within the bedrock. So then what we use for groundwater exploration as well as contaminant studies. But if you can identify, for example, if you went to the existing wells, I'm not even sure where they are, Mr. Straw, but the 1 and 2, you could do surveys by those and see if there's any fracture zones there, any major fracture zones. It sounds like it will just show the rocks competent, that aren't any fracture zones. These things are not hydraulically connected. The wells aren't hydraulically connected to the groundwater, possibly. But you could also take these surveys and conduct them and decide where to put monitoring wells, new monitoring wells, so that it maximizes the potential for them intercepting what might be a high yielding water bearing zone. So that, and you can also, if you do a series of parallel ones, you can tell the orientation of those fracture zones. So you can tell if they propagate into the bedrock, into the quarry. If it's an east-west fracture zone, that's a big concern. You want to have a monitoring well there, because as you go down, then you might intercept water that would drain that fracture zone. So we suggested using that method. It just adds that extra element of looking at fractures within the bedrock, and could enhance the monitoring program, both the existing monitoring program and the proposed monitoring program.
And then I guess 2 questions that I'm hoping you can answer. When we did the site visit, did you see anything visible that would give you reason to think there might be some high yield fracture zones or some issues with the groundwater? And then my other question would be if the monitoring well locations 1 and 2 aren't all that indicative and really warrant no more than every 5 years looking at them, would proposed locations, new locations for monitoring wells be more appropriate, and then also testing those semi-annually, which was what was recommended?
Right, yeah, I think that would be the case if depending on the results of the electrical resistivity survey, that could help guide the sampling interval for those wells, both water level monitoring and water quality. Typically, when we do water level monitoring for a long-term program, it's using recording, digitizing pressure sensors that are permanently installed in those wells. So you're getting measurements, you set the measurement interval, but for something like this, you might measure 8 measurements per day. And so then you see water level variations with daily variations quite often in bedrock. Even in bedrock, there's a couple of feet variation. But if you download those quarterly, you would you get an immediate reading for when this thing's going down. You compare it to precipitation and you compare it to the withdrawals from the sump, and you can analyze how much water might be coming into the sump from the groundwater fracture zones versus precipitation. So it's all part of a comprehensive monitoring program. What was the other question you asked?
I was just going to say, so when we went out to our site walk, yeah.
Yeah, no, it was obvious that the walls of the quarry were highly fractured. You've all seen that, I think, if you've been down in there. There was what appeared to be a east-west trending mafic dike on the order of, I would say 60 feet wide, something like that. You could see it in both the western wall and the eastern wall. Quite often, mafic dikes, these are magmas that have intruded up into the bedrock because the bedrock's expanding, basically. It's during tectonics, it extends and magma comes up. Well, quite often the edges of those mafic dikes we use for groundwater exploration as targets because during the initial fracturing of the rock, it's all broken up, and then the mafic intrudes along it, and there's a selvage of highly fractured rock along the edge of the mafic dike, which could be a high yield zone below the water table. So we didn't do at all a comprehensive fracture trace analysis on these rocks or anything like that, but those were two things I just raised a little concern. Often these granites, you can see spacing of 10 to 20 feet between fractures. That was not the case in the quarry. And some of them were probably developed during the actual blasting in the upper portion of the quarry. But there is a very systematic north-south and also east-west fracture sets that could be observed.
Perhaps this would be a good time for me to bring up, it's obviously not my field, but I did a little bit of research on the topic of earthquakes to not get too deep in it. But shortly after the Pilgrims arrived, 18 years after that, there was apparently, according to the written record, a magnitude 6.5 earthquake centered near the Concord area. And the Northeast States Emergency Consortium website has a nice graphic that shows where various earthquakes have occurred. And yes, most of them are much smaller than that. But it sounds like, since we don't have a record, I guess, of prior to colonial settlement, something like every few hundred years, there might be a significant earthquake. So my question for the engineers who might know better than I, if the proposed expansion of excavation were to be done, and a 6.5 magnitude earthquake were to occur with an epicenter within 10 miles, what would the likely effects on Dover's well be?
So this is where I have to suggest that this calls for speculation that I haven't heard any expert qualify themselves to answer. If somebody wants to take a shot at it because we're all together, fine. We have no choice but to say, how would we know? Where is this coming from? What's the likelihood? This is really a field. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll let John give a brief. I don't want to go too deep into the.
Okay, no, I was going to say, I think that's totally true. One other, sorry, but it's both unpredictable when they're going to occur and also what the impacts of them are. We've seen it open fractures and closed fractures, so that would be a very difficult, would be total speculation, I think. One thing I think I have been meaning to mention is that in the plans, in the mitigation plans, but what if we hit a water bearing zone? We haven't seen any criteria for how big a yield would be important to the coring activities. It was mentioned, well, if we hit water, we have to stop coring. But is that if you hit 50 gallons a minute or 10 gallons a minute? So I think in the future plan, it would be nice to know what those criteria are. And I'm sure it's an economic criteria for them. But, that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, and before, I just don't, we can go down every hypothetical situation and what may or may not occur. My feeling on some of this stuff is specific proposed ideas of monitoring should have been brought forward a lot sooner in the process so they could have been parsed out. We're talking a lot about the ways water move and fractures and education, and that's wonderful to know. But I think we're at a point in this where specific and I'm talking location, depth, frequency should have been, say, we want a monitoring well in this spot, monitored every 5 years, say yes or no, not what if this happens? We're kind of past the point of what if this happens, I think. We've been in this a while that we know what's going to happen. We know the impacts potentially, all potentially, and there should have been some specifics that we're talking about with this. I think this is where we're at, talking about these specifics that we're looking at. I think our focus should stay here as to not prolong the discussion, even though it's interesting. I love the education portion of it, but we're just kind of
along Jamie's line. My general take on it is a lot of this sounds like there are items that would be discussed further with DES at an AOT level or at a functional level there, as opposed to a planning board approval level to move forward with a project.
Yeah, I'm leaning the same way. I think we're talking a 5.5 acre site, talking about limited to 120. I agree there's risk when we go lower into the groundwater, but it seems to me this delays going deeper in existing wells, and it doesn't seem to approach a level that causes any significant risk, and it seems to benefit by delaying, getting more information before we go deeper. So I am kind of unpersuaded by the fact that, this is a full stop. I mean, I think the applicant has been persuasive in saying this will allow us to do more work, and get better baseline information. So when we go deeper, we'll all have better information. And this will allow more time to do that. And I think going below 120 doesn't represent a significant risk. So to me, I'm kind of thinking this is a good thing. It gives you more time to get more information, stay above 120. And when, as Andy says, when DES steps in, as they should, the information will be better and everybody will have a chance to talk more intelligent.
Can I just answer a couple questions? One, we had been working with the folks from Brox and Mike White, and actually they were working directly with John Brooks to talk about these types of things, monitoring well locations. And then we stopped hearing really any of the information. We continued to reach out through Barbara to try and talk about the monitoring wells, and sort of have ended up here without those pieces that we've been asking for kind of all along. So I don't want to give the impression that we're coming in at the 11th hour, having paid no attention and looking for specifics. And then the other thing, I agree that and as was discussed at the last meeting, that the expansion would potentially allow them to have all this time to get the added data. But then you heard from the applicant that they weren't comfortable with expanding their request for the data to the existing quarry because they didn't want to halt production. So they didn't want to stop what they're doing. And I had heard at the last meeting that they did want to propose and work into the new 5 acres expansion to allow them to have the time to get the data so that they didn't need to go into the groundwater sub 120 in the existing. So, you know, again, it's legally, it sounds like that there's nothing you can do, but I was a little taken aback that they were so opposed to having that be part of their approval, especially where they're accepting it on 2 other conditions. You know, we'd really, again, we're just trying to protect water quality. We're just trying to make sure that that does, and I assume that they're trying to do the same thing. So I'm concerned that that was a non-starter for them. But legally, it sounds like there's nothing we could do.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective and theirs, I mean, that's why we've taken our time with this and made sure we didn't rush anything, certainly. But I guess back to my point was, I don't recall here specific requests that are not in front of you right now that's been ignored, not considered previous to this. And so to continue to talk about potentials, which I heard, and that's why I think we slowed this right down to a crawl, but to continue to talk about potential impacts and not have brought up specific requests to mitigate those potential impacts before now, we're just still talking about potential impacts. Still haven't heard, I want 7 wells along this line tested every week. We're talking about what we do here and what we should do and stuff like that. But and so it's really hard to make any decision to move forward based on potential impacts. And I think that's where I feel I am. I think between CMAs and the applicants' agreements on this, we're pretty close. And the 80-acre separate thing is new this meeting. So that's one topic. But the rest of the stuff, I think that we're kind of moving down the line, and we need to move past potentials. The other thing, well, on the topic is how much can you do on your own property that's proposed to be done, if anything, and part 2 of that is there's stuff that you would propose to do for Brock's on their property if that was an acceptable option. Those are things I would have liked to have heard by now. We will put in 17 wells and monitor at our cost if they allow us to. Those would have been things I would have wanted to hear previous to this, I guess.
So those discussions did happen, and I'm looking to John Brooks to maybe talk about some of the specifics, but they were happening, and then and then we stopped hearing anything.
I guess
It wasn't brought to this board.
Planning board.
Right. Those discussions, if they were going on, wasn't here.
Okay.
Now, that being said, you still have your opportunity because of that 120 to, when they need their alteration of terrain, you have your opportunity with the state, and you can talk about the different monitoring systems, how each one's better. I'm sure DES has some experts, and they'll probably agree with your assessment or disagree, but they're the experts on this. This board technically has to just apply its regulations, and I think Brock's has met the intent of the regulations in the monitoring that was set up on the new section. I think this board as a whole would like it to apply to the whole thing, but legally they can't. So it's not that this board is ignoring those things, but you still have another avenue to make sure those things are taken care of.
You know, I think that we understand your concerns. It's significant.
Sure.
We're not trying to, suggest they're not. But, really the state has the authority here, and you clearly have standing. If something were to happen and you wanted to appeal, you'd have standing to appeal. You'll have a chance to input into the state. They have the authority. They have the expertise. They have the purview. And I think, to me, for us to get into this opens up the liability. Because, to some extent, I see us taking a liability by saying, we are experts. We're going to make decisions here. Now, if something goes wrong, we have liability for things that we said, by getting in there, we're opening ourselves to liability.
Okay.
So I think it's the concerns you have, which are completely valid, I would state. And, to me, kind of agreeing with John that we have our piece, how small it may be. And like I say, and I know it's not what you want to hear, but that's the way I look at it.
I do understand what you're saying. I would hate for you to think that we hadn't been very proactive about, opportunities to work together and find monitoring wells, and the city would work in monitoring wells, and all of that was happening. So, we hope we can.
You still have a right to negotiate with rocks outside of
Yep.
this. We're not saying you can't talk to them.
Yep.
You guys still, you guys have to work into back and forth, and you still got this stuff with DES. I think it would be beneficial for you guys to keep negotiating on what you can do to come to a consensus that works for both of you.
Okay.
But it's beyond this board scope, I guess, is the point I was trying to make.
And I'm curious, I guess, Bill Straub, if anything that came up today would alter any of your recommendations or modify any of your recommendations.
Is this Gretchen? I can't see you.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. I thought the modified recommendations were fine and thoughtful. I'm not prepared. The sampling frequency, that's easy. You can figure that out. And I think there's probably not a lot of distance between everybody on that. The geophysical techniques, you probably know more about the geophysical techniques than I do. I'm very familiar with seismic refraction profiling. I've used the other a little bit, not a lot. And if it has the advantages that John described, I would be fine to consider that. I don't know the distinctions between the two a lot. I've used some electrical methods some time ago for plume mapping, not for bedrock characterization. So if that's a better way to do it, that's fine. So, in terms of the relative position of the expansion and the permanent pit, I've already made my statement on that. It's more of a legal issue than a technical issue. I think technically it's justified to proceed on the whole thing, but it's not going to happen legally.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Jeff, you wanted this extend?
Yeah, going back to some comments that have been made, I guess I want to question, Dover, Bill, Josh, Josh, as
John.
to this process for the AOT permitting. Does AOT reach out to abutters and or accept input from the public and abutters as part of their process?
I don't. Go ahead.
They don't technically reach out, but Dover has a right to come forward and give their opinion to anything that has to do with the state. And they'll listen to, any concerns that are out there to make sure that those concerns are addressed if they find them legit.
I agree with that. I agree with that. There's not an outreach per se, but input is taken.
Well, and to that point, if I remember correctly, I believe Dover just got an award from New Hampshire DES for asset management to include their wells. So there appears to be a pretty close relationship.
It would be my hope that when AOT
involved you standing is basically if you were impacted more than the general public at large. Clearly Dover.
It's just whether they're notified, I think was Jeff's point. AOT notifies, talks to people in the process. Let's just quickly address any other public comments if we have any out there. Do you see any online?
Participating virtually, you'd like to make a public comment, you can raise your hand, or participate on the phone, press *6 to unmute yourself, speak up, wait to be recognized by the chair. Action this way, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. Ron, if you want to, thank you. Didn't mean to cut you off. Hey,
Nope, I'm done.
we'll close public comment. Certainly, Mr. Brooks, I'd ask you to, if you have input, feel free during the conversation if you want to add something.
I was only going to say that went on for a while. We could sit here and rebut any number of items and drag on the conversation. I agree with the feedback the board provided. You know, one of the reasons we asked the board to engage peer review was we needed some way to bring closure to this process. We were just sort of not, I don't want to say flailing, but we were adrift on moving the ball forward. And I appreciate the board's response to that. I appreciate CMA's involvement. We came last time looking to bring some closure, and as the chairman said, try to boil it down to some words that could be looked at, figure out what makes sense and what doesn't. And so we did that. The process, I think, unfolded exactly the way we were all anticipating it would, and we worked, well with CMA. The notion that we're going to put a condition on to demand or require recharge, I mean, the irony just kills me that, we require that you give us your water, but we're really worried about what's in it. I don't know what to do with that. And so, again, to me, that's a great thing to discuss when and if this plan is conceived and have input on various levels by experts who can weigh in, state, town, peer review, whomever. I agree with the general sentiment that I don't know what this board could do with that.
My only question coming out of that was the difference between the seismic refraction and the electrical resistivity. If you're in
You don't want
one
me
versus
answering.
another.
You don't want me answering that. I need Mike to come up.
Cost, is it an information?
I have not had great luck with the resistivity. I have done numerous quarries where we have gravel aquifers and not just sanding gravel, but just gravel abutting up to rock. And we've been looking for fractures and all these other things. And I've had people swear up and down to me, promise me in reading that data, you have a fracture here and a fracture here. We drilled with a core rig and we drilled with a special core rig to actually mark the core so that I could specifically see a core, its orientation and everything else, the fracture. And we didn't find it in either of those cases. I agree with Bill's, and what we're trying to do is identify just where the rock boundary was. I think Bill's recommendation was accurate for that. The other will do it too, but I don't agree with it locating the electro-resistivity, finding any of the fractures or anything that we're really looking for. Again, I've never had luck with it, but we're willing to try anything. But I think Bill's was a reasonable one that I think.
Well, we discussed this issue of using seismic refraction. Where did we get to? Is there an agreement to do that?
Yes.
The seismic, yes. Seismic's in there.
Okay.
And Dover brought up the electrical resistivity, and I just wanted to see the difference between the two. And I understand.
I can tell you, just trying to use electrical resistivity in a concrete application where I'm not going hundreds of feet in the ground, I can't get accurate information that close. So going to a significant depth, I can understand the challenge tied to that. I've had better luck with the, say a prayer and cut and see what I get out of it.
I've had Dowser people come out and had more luck.
Yep.
And I'm sure there's some benefit to it, and I don't want to, one way or another, but I just want to bring that up, and if that was a cost issue or no.
I don't think I don't know, I'm not aware of a difference in cost, really. I wouldn't be able to price that out and tell you if I go. For the 5 acres we're talking about.
I'm looking for a next step.
Use their thing that they brought forward for the draft. Draft notice. And I wrote in the staff recommendations that I sent over to discuss their draft note and if there's any changes made and to use that as a decision. The latest one that the one that they gave,
right?
Change that.
The yellow.
With the yellow on the bottom.
So Jeff and Steve, do you have the one with the yellow highlight?
No, that was just given to us.
They do have CNA's original, the date in the top right of that.
January
the
7th.
same.
Yeah, so That January 7th document from CMA, the two are identical.
But just the markup one is not.
And we did,
No, that's
Still has
one
the same
we go
date.
The highlighting, the difference.
the one from Dover has the.
No, the one that you
red,
have
like,
printed in your packet is what Dover emailed.
Right.
Yeah, so where's the CMA one?
That was.
It's the one with-
Essentially. No,
That's
this is, no,
that's
this
rocks.
is
But
rocks.
what I'm telling you is that is CMA.
Okay.
With only that yellow difference.
All
But
right.
for the benefit of Steve and Jeff, that January 7th document was forwarded to the board back about 2 weeks ago. And so the document's the same with that one exception.
The other noted change that was on here is we changed biennially
Oh,
to biannually
Yep, make sure that.
So you could read that
or
as,
semi-annually.
as your notice.
I just want Steve and Jeff to know we're reading from the same document. And,
And the only real change is
Small change.
the biannually thing, and then it's not gonna include the
board. Anything to add? All right, I will read this. Can I read this one? That'll help.
The only thing that I have is the marked up copy that Dover did of the original.
So, to not add confusion, so between Dover's and what I'm reading, strike out 8 on Dover's, strike out 7. Number 6 is the same. Number 5 has 2 changes. One, the first line that says, or other work is removed. It reads, prior to any excavation activities on lot 4. That's the wording we'll be using as opposed to or other work. That'll be struck out. And lower down in 5, it's removed the electrical resistivity. And then, yep, the typo on number 4 under the first sump, biannually, twice a year. And monitoring wells will be every 5 years and not semi-annually. Those should be the only changes you hear as I read, and please help me, correct me if you hear something different. I'll stutter. This is to inform you that the Barrington Planning Board at its January 18, 2022 meeting conditionally approved your application referenced above. Precedent conditions below must be met by the applicant at the expense of the applicant prior to the plans being certified by the planning board. Certification of the plans is required prior to commencement of any site work or recording of any plans. Once these precedent conditions are met and the plans are certified, the approval is considered final. Please note, if all the precedent conditions are not met within 6 calendar months to the day, by July 18, 2022, the board's approval will be considered to have lapsed unless a mutually agreed upon extension has been granted by the board. Reference 8223, Town of Barrington Subdivision Regulations. This isn't a subdivision. No. So, we'll strike that reference number. Leave it. All right. Conditions precedents. 1, all notes on plan set dated October 12th, 2020, as submitted are incorporated by reference as conditions of approval. 2, all erosion and sediment control measures included on the project plans shall be in place prior to commencement of excavation activities on lot 4. 3, excavation activities on lot 4 shall not commence prior to receipt of all necessary state of New Hampshire approvals, included but not limited to an alteration of terrain permit from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services applicable to lot 4 and as may also apply to other parts of the existing permitted excavation and other permits or approvals that may be required. 4, on approval of the application, commence a groundwater quality monitoring program by obtaining grab samples from the sump discharge to the infiltration gallery and sample the 2 existing bedrock monitoring wells at the quarry MW-1 and MW-2 according to the following schedule. Monitoring location, sump. Frequency, biannually, meaning twice a year, May and October. Parameters, TPH, chloride, nitrate, TKN, pH, specific conductance, sulfate, iron, manganese, arsenic. Some monitoring location, sump, annually every October. Parameters, VOCs using EPA method 8260, including 1,4-dioxane. Monitoring location, monitoring well 1 and monitoring well 2. Frequency every 5 years. Parameters, gauge, all parameters above. We know what this means.
Yes, we do.
Laboratory reporting shall be filed annually with the town planning department. 5, prior to any excavation activities on lot 4, proceeding below the elevation of 120 ASL, applicant shall prepare, submit, and receive approval from the planning board and New Hampshire DES as may be required for a bedrock water level monitoring and reporting plan consistent with current or future New Hampshire DES alteration of terrain permits or other New Hampshire DES permitting requirements, and consistent with the recommendations of CMA engineers in its peer report to the planning board dated December 20, 2021. The plan will include description of actions to be taken if groundwater dewatering occurs that can negatively affect the city of Dover well or other water resources. The scope for the investigations and plan development will be submitted to the planning board and New Hampshire DES for approval prior to commencing the investigations, with sufficient time for approval and completion of the plan prior to excavating below elevation 120 ASL. The scope will include additional investigations of hydrogeologic conditions, including seismic refraction profiling of the elevation of the bedrock between the existing and planned excavation and the aquifer containing the city of Dover water supply wells. Fracture analysis, integration of data from the city of Dover well site, potentially additional bedrock isometers, observation wells, and other measures deemed applicable. 6, prior to excavation activities commencing on lot 4 and every 5 years thereafter, updating and filing with the planning board the existing operations plan dated June 19th, 2009 to incorporate new and continued excavation activities on lot 4 and to document current and then existing excavation elevations, historic quarry water pumping volumes, and site safety measures to limit unauthorized access. The operations plan shall document best management practices to safeguard against impacts from blasting activities upon water quality. Just anything else I read or add to that?
So you need someone to motion in a second.
At this time,
Make a motion, we approve application 236-4-GR-20-SR.
Conditions that were.
With the conditions that Chairman read.
motion by Ron Allard, seconded by Andy Melnikas. James Jennison, aye. Jeff Brand,
Brand, aye.
Steve Diamond,
Diamond, nay.
Andy Knapp,
Aye.
Ron Allard,
Allard, aye.
Andy M. 5-1. Motion passes. Thank you very much. Best of luck.
Thank you.
don't have 4 on my sheet, but I see one in the pile.
Some private.
Down
Oh,
the
there it
bottom
is.
of
I
the other bit.
apologize. Wasn't looking far enough ahead. Number 4, skip these. Okay. Number 4, review a request for a building permit on Orchard Hill Road, a Class 6 road for David Tedeschi. Is he related to the Tedeschi Trucks band?
No. So Mark Monroe was the only one that responded back.
Email.
So Jeff, could you read that off for us, Mark's thing? Because Margaret emailed it to you, but she forgot to print it out for us. You just sent it?
Hold on a second.
Yeah.
She sent it tonight while during the meeting.
Yeah, okay, hold on. Okay, so you want what the road agent had to say?
Yes, please.
Okay, so this is what?
Keep going, no, background noise.
Okay. Okay, so email dated Wednesday, January 12th. He said, I've inspected the road in front of the property at map 236, lot 20, Orchard Hill Road, owned by David Tedeschi, and I made the following observations. The current Class 6 portion along the frontage of the property does not meet the town requirement of a 16-foot travelway with 2-foot shoulders on both sides. This condition exists from the corner of Orchard Hill Road at the transition from Class 5 to Class 6. The current average width is 13 to 14 feet with hardly any shoulders and spots. According to our policy adopted by the Select Board in 2004, this road must be made 16 feet wide with 2-foot shoulders and be topped with 4 inches of crushed gravel. This needs to extend to 50 feet beyond the furthermost point of the driveway entrance. With this said, I must state that any widening on the property owner's side of the road will have significant wetlands impact and destabilization of existing embankments, along with the need for culvert extensions. The road would be more easily widened on the opposite side from the Tedeschi property, even though there would still be need for culvert extensions. There would be a lot of large tree removal on this side, and the widening would introduce a curve into the road because in effect, you'll be shifting the road over and then shifting it back to its original alignment. This information is not a recommendation from on my part, just observation. Mark Moreau, road agent.
Thank you, Jeff. Do we have comments?
I have a general comment on Orchard Hill Road, and that the bottom section of that still has major problems tied to it, and the town was working through, I guess, some of that based on the prior agreement with the landowner where we had allowed 3 units as it came up around the bend.
Right, that was a Class 5 portion of the road. That is being worked on and addressed. The Class 5 portion is for the selectmen's purpose. It's the Class 6 portion.
Right.
Because there's 2 things. One is to issue the building permit. The other, any work done on that Class 6 section part of the road, the selectmen have to authorize. Right. So with that said, Mark was making suggestions on how to best fix the road to get it to the 16 foot. Mm-hmm. And I guess from a board point of view, it makes sense. So unless you guys know something more about that Class 6 portion, then sometimes there's things in front of the planning board that the planning board knows that the selectmen should know when they make their decision. That's the reason why for the comment from the planning board.
Well, and if I remember, those culverts running up there, the drainage swales are pretty big. Like you can swallow a vehicle on those things.
A lot of
they dump off.
A lot of work was done up there when Jim Connick's built that house for where his son lives farther up. There was quite a bit of that road that was upgraded at that time. The selectmen, even though their policy had the 16-foot travel way with the 2-foot shoulders, had basically been waiving that on a pretty regular basis. So technically the selectmen still can, but it looks like from the meetings that you were part of the meeting, but for me watching it, it looked like they were more interested in trying to meet that minimum standard unless someone could demonstrate a hardship why it couldn't be, and then an alternative, how they could make sure it stayed safe.
Right.
So with that said, that's why this is a little different than the ones that you made your recommendations in the past. And then after we're done this one, there's going to be a conversation about the policy that's in place now. And Connor's going to help facilitate that so that the selectmen can know how the planning board feels about their policy and maybe making modifications to it. I hope I didn't go too long-winded on it, but I was just trying to explain what
appropriate. The select board conversation, as John alluded to, centered around the fact that often the planning board may have feedback, but doesn't really give a whole lot of feedback because it just gets punted to the select board, and then the select board.
Well, it's the selectmen's policy and their decision, so.
Policy, even though
The selectmen policy, they have the final say. Can we even waive the policy since it's not our policy?
No,
So
planning board can't waive it, but you can provide feedback on it for the select board.
You could recommend it doesn't get waived, or you could say, maybe you could do this, so you don't have to waive it, or this makes sense, they got to turn out at this area, so you got good sight distance, so you think that waiving it for this specific case is reasonable, but that's
this is a new house, right? It's a brand new house,
correct.
which, by the way, I noticed in his application, he's going to build for $200,000. Does that, I'm very impressed.
It's probably what his material cost.
Right.
I think he wants to have a look at, see his per construction cost. I think it's
In previous years, I remember the fire chief, I think, took some pictures in the wintertime and was definitely had concerns. Now, is this, were his concerns, for those who might remember, regarding the class 5 portion or the class 6 area? Is this stuff that has already been corrected, or would he still be?
Yeah, the class 5 portion, that other house was real close to the road, they got taken down. The road's been realigned there. There's a little bit of a hill just before the road turns that's kind of steep that they looked at possibly blasting or doing something with to try to make the topography there work a little better. And then those houses that were going in, they actually gave an easement to the town so that the drainage ditch could move over farther, so that section could be wider there. And that was agreed upon when they did their subdivision. The planning board negotiated that easement language with him as part of their subdivision approval. But that's
So
the class 5 portion. That's different than the class 6 that we're discussing tonight. It's part of the same road.
Yeah. So much of the concerns that the fire chief raised at the time have been addressed, is what you're saying?
The section in the first part, correct. That was where the house, I mean, the house was like right on the road. They put a guardrail up that was like a foot from the house, and it was right on the edge. I mean, there was no place to plow snow or anything. It was
it was not only narrow, but there was a bend there around the house, right?
Correct.
The house came down, and as I recall, there is a steep slope after that area.
Correct.
Going into the class 6 road, but the class 5 was what was the.
Well, the steep slope is actually part of the class 5 section before
Is
they
it?
changed to class 6, but it's right close to where they changed, because it changes when it gets around the corner at the old Atwood house.
Right. And the class 6 section it runs uphill. It's not, I wouldn't say it's.
It's not
crazy
real steep, no.
But
It's just that little hump right by that house, the second house on the right.
right, and it runs uphill a long way, and they had dug out the drainage swales in there. It's not a road you would want to go off on because you're not recovering yourself from it.
Ditch lines.
Nice.
Yeah, love for.
Oh, I also noted in this application that he's talking about it. I guess he's going to have to go to New Hampshire, DES, because he wants to put in a culvert, a concrete culvert across the stream.
Yeah, so any work that done, even a replacement culvert, requires permits from DES. So that's part of that work upgrade and the culverts and the extensions and stuff of them that Mark was talking about. I think he's trying to get a defined area to where the selectmen who agree to those upgrades, so he knows exactly what he has to get permitted from DES. And I know originally he started working on the concept of the 20-foot, 2-foot shoulders, which was going to be a major upgrade, and that's the reason why he stopped, because he's trying to deal with the selectmen in their current policy.
Is there a reason why the agenda item why there isn't any links on the agenda for this item? Usually there's a link in documents on the web.
This was something that but this class 6 and private road one was already on your agenda. The other one for the next thing, discussing the policy, that was, if that's the one you're talking about, that was something that, was it, when did you brought it up, or last Thursday, Connor? It was last Thursday? Yeah, I remember you asked us if we could just add it to the agenda for discussion purposes, because it's not something that you have to do, that you got to vote on, which required posting. Just a general discussion about how you feel about it, and if there's something that you want to work on about changing things, but that's the next agenda item, not where we are to break this minute. With Item 4 does not have a link to any documents, is my point.
Is 25 or 26, either one of those the green space behind fell zones? Or is that further down the map?
That's farther down.
Okay. I guess, what does the board want to send? The road agent's recommendations along? We support the road agent's recommendations? Does that seem reasonable? I mean, he's leaning towards widening.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
And if he can get the other side of the road to help him out and let him do it, for his cost, it seems to make sense, right?
I think on that thing, your question, 26 was the one that is part of fell zones. 25 was the one that we changed to be in general residential that had the commercial layout on it. That was part of that zoning changes.
Was pulling it up right now.
I'm pretty sure that's what it is. I'm pretty sure 25, and when I looked at that, 25 looks like the one that the guy agreed to that change to residential. If you look on that petition, warrant articles that we brought forward to change.
The discussion happened over here in case you can't hear. I was just curious if this was the backside of fell zones green space or if those were just to get a.
Anyways, on 20, there's 2 houses across the street, and the other one that was put in when the road was upgraded before is just past 20. You can see the little driveway on 23.
So there's 2 houses on 19?
Well, it's on 19 is a house, and then a little.
17.
Yeah. And then there's the other driveway that goes on 15 and 14. There's actually houses there. And that long one that goes across 20 and up 22, that's curved because it goes up really steep, and there's a tower there. I think it's a radio station tower that was up there. I've had to go up and inspect it when they did some upgrades on it. And that driveway curves for a reason. I mean, it's really steep going up there.
Yeah. Are we all comfortable sending our standard letter with support of the road agent's recommendations?
I'm good.
Okay.
Yes. This guy a subdivision is a totally different thing than.
Well, I'm saying about the other 2, yeah.
The subdivision would require it to be built to the subdivision standard, which is totally different.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking with 25 and 23 come in, as long as we're not short-sighted. All right, so motion to send our standard letter with the addition of support for the road agent's recommendations.
I make a motion to send the standard letter to the select board with the road agent's recommendations for the Tedeschi property.
Motion by Jeff Brand, that was Ron Allard. Second by Ron Allard. Andy M. Ron Allard.
Allard, aye.
Andy Knapp.
Abstain, sending it to me.
Steve Diamond.
Diamond eye.
Jeff Brand.
Brand, aye.
Dave Dennison, aye. 5 in favor. Thank you. Approved, passed. Next, discussion of private road, class 6.
This is the current town policy, select policy, building permit. 6 road.
Yeah, and that did get emailed to me, so I did have that.
It's called my full attention.
Thanks for printing, because I
Okay.
printed it, left it on the printer at work,
Oh, don't worry, they'll find you and charge you for the paper.
probably.
Is there anything like that?
I will say that we're 2.25 hours in here. It's time for me to take a short break, so.
You can join Ron.
Yeah.
If you wanna- I'm gonna,
Well, we're about the same age.
yeah. Do I want to take a quick little break? It looks
Sure.
like, all right. We'll get started without Jeff.
Camera?
We don't need. Yeah, you like, I'm good.
Jeff's not back yet? No. All right, I'll wait. Got so much work done. This is gonna be a little bit of a meeting. Trying to put as much of the select board's willing to accept.
Maybe a little they're not willing to accept
Well,
it.
you know, let's just see how close you guys pay attention. I'm just gonna slip in. So,
Hey, you should just be pumped. I got all those intent to cut signed today, including that second one that you sent after the fact.
I don't know about that one. So the
Yeah, I went back in.
the first one,
as in a butter.
Okay, so the Class 6 and private road policy, select board
Maybe I'll
started a review of this policy back in November, I think, in order to do our best with access and make sure if there's any change we want to make. So the select board, in reviewing their policy, concluded that there wasn't anything that they wanted to change, but that they wanted to implement the policy as it was written. Now, the policy as it's written, if it's applied as it's written, there will be some changes. And we're going to talk about that a little more specifically with the select board at the meeting on the 24th. But at the last meeting, when the planning board was talking about Finney Way, it became clear to me that the planning board has this planning board is very interested in access and improved access when possible. So far, so much as the planning board, from my perspective, seemed like you folks were considering requiring somebody to upgrade a pretty good section of road because you had the opportunity to with a lot line adjustment. And so I think that's a noble effort. I think that's a good quality of this planning board to use your authority when you have it to improve access. So the select board, this policy, the Class 6 and private road policy, has one purpose, and that one purpose is to improve access, period. It doesn't contemplate anything else. All of 674 and 641 is about access in delegating the authority to the select board. That's why this policy was written. And so the old way that the process was administered is people put in an application, department heads reviewed it, planning board reviewed it, goes to the select board. And the select board, as John pointed out earlier, has routinely waived portions or large portions of the policy, specifically as it relates to access. And that waiver process happens after the review. It happens essentially at the select board meeting. This is what you have to do, don't have to. And so it doesn't really give a good opportunity for the department heads, and in this case, specifically the planning board, to consider the specifics of what they're proposing to do, what they're offering to do, or if they're asking for a waiver, what are they asking for a waiver of? And does the planning board support that waiver, or does the planning board want to recommend the select board hold up to the specifics of the policy? Because as just happened with the Tedeschi review, the planning board generally says we support department head recommendations. But I think that there's a role for the planning board as it relates to the access specifics. And you haven't necessarily always done that, not to your fault, but I don't necessarily think the process has always afforded the planning board the specific details of what we're looking at. So a few things specifically that I'm going to go over with the select board on the meeting on the 24th. So the policy, as it's written, says that the road standards, and I'm in section 4.
It starts on 2, it carries into 3.
So section 4A says there has to be a permit for work on class 6 roads. We've always done that informally. We're going to formalize the process, develop a specific permit signed by the select board, not really a problem. That's the planning board. In 4B, something that renewed interest was different for me is that the standards of the class 6 and private road policy are the subdivision regulations. So the road standards in the subdivision regulations, 30 feet wide for private roads, that's what the standards are. And it goes on to say the board reserves the right at their discretion to waive the application of such standards or any portion thereof for good cause shown for the construction of only a single family dwelling on a single lot. In such a waiver, if in case such a waiver is granted, the applicant shall nonetheless adhere to the following minimum requirements. So what this policy says is Roman numeral 1 through 5 listed below, the 16 feet with 2-foot shoulders, the 4 inches of crushed gravel. Those are the minimum standards. So for the select board to follow this policy as it's written, they shouldn't waive the standard below what's listed there. That's how the policy is written. The select board has consistently done that. Part of the conversation I'm going to have with them on the 24th is if you intend to consider waivers beyond the 16 feet with 2-foot shoulders, it's your policy. You can change it, but you should change it. You shouldn't have a policy that you're considering consistently side of.
Well, haven't we seen a number of permits that they didn't meet these minimum standards that are in the policy?
That's the point I'm making.
Yeah.
That's the exact point I'm making. So the select board's gonna have to decide, and part of my hope here is that the planning board would be willing to weigh in for consideration of the select board. The select board's gonna have to decide, okay, this policy as it was written hasn't been applied as it's been written, which isn't improper in any way, right? Because it's the select board's policy, they can do whatever they want. They make political provisions in their capacity with 674-40. But the policy nonetheless should be consistent with what they're doing. So a resident can look at the policy, read it, and know what to expect. And so as it relates to this area, first question for the planning board to consider is, do you think the select board should be waiving a standard beyond the minimum standards listed in the policy? Minimum standards being 16 feet, 2-foot shoulders, 4 inches of crushed gravel, culverts is required by the road agent, turnaround required by the fire chief, and pavement that may be required or other relevant circumstances, combination of departments. Does the planning board have an opinion worth sharing with the select board, that section?
Well, I mean, my first comment was, if they would adhere to this policy, that would be better than what's been done in the past.
Just to give a little history on it, I mean, I was part of the committee when this was first written, and there's either been 2 changes or 3 changes that I was involved in. So when the selectmen first allowed things with less than this 16 foot, I hate to say it, but it was Longshores. I mean, it always comes back to very Reverend Longshores. It was a Longshores application. It was one where it was quite a ways down the road. And the selectmen felt that to have that first person that was 3/4 of the way down the road build this to the whole standard to get access to their lots, so everybody else in front of them didn't have to do anything. That's when the selectmen looked at it from the point of view of, we want it to be good enough so that we don't lose a $500 million fire truck in the middle of the road and we can't get it back. So they come up with do this, or whatever was recommended. And most of it was add a couple of truckloads of gravel, maybe a little bit of coal patch that was given to the association to address some of the hill steepness and slopes. So that's how the selectmen got into the process of not following their own thing with systematic upgrades. The concept of, you can get an oil truck or a gas truck in there, we can get our fire truck in and out. With that said, the selectmen today, and because of relooking at this policy, are more in the lines of especially year-round maintenance to get in and out and stuff. And they're looking at this current policy. And as Connor mentioned, that 30 foot he mentioned on that stuff in our subdivision was actually the right-of-way requirement. I think it was 22 feet of travel way with shoulders that went along with it. But that's still a higher standard than this 16 foot that they say they can go down to. And as you said, they've been going even lower because of that situation that got started. So as new selectmen come on, the older selectmen are saying, we waive this, we waive this, we waive this, we waive this, and people weren't really looking at the policy like you said. So there's been many done that didn't even come close to that 16 foot and the 2 foot shoulders. I 100% agree. So that's where we're at now.
Well, similar to that lot line adjustment, the select board, every time an application comes forward, the select board has a statutory authority to require improvements to be made to access. And the town doesn't regularly have bites at the apple to improve access, because we don't have control over private roads, and we don't want control over class 6 roads, because then we're going to be required to have control of class 6 roads. And so the standards as they're written we've been going below them. What is the planning board?
But the select board has the ultimate hammer, which is denied.
Right, but we're saying, what's our opinion, so we can pass that along, and then we'll see what their hammer squashes.
Or if the planning board's opinion is you should consider using the hammer and denying building permit applications if they can't meet the 16 feet. If that's how the plan, if that is the planning board's opinion, then that would be an opinion you could share with the select board.
Well,
I have that opinion.
That's where I feel like the middle ground really is. I mean, the planning board could say, hey, we just want you to follow the private road standards, which are more expansive than what these rules are in 4B. But at this point, with all the roads that already exist, and if the select board wanted to drop the standards down to this, but they were willing to enforce this, that'd be an improvement over where we're at today.
In the past week, I've gotten 2 applications on private roads. Neither of those 2 private roads meet this standard. And there are existing houses that are on the road that they want to do upgrade to. So that's where it come down to where, let's say they can't meet this standard. They can only do 14-foot wide, but they're able to do turnouts that are in sight distance coming down through, so emergency access can be maintained with the fire trucks going in and out trying to supply water. With that said, it might be a thing to where you do this, the section 1 in the very first page, where it talks about these things can be done without having to meet that standard, as long as the indemnification thing is signed. Now, what about an existing home that has an expansion, which is number 2? That's where we get into the thing to where a guy wants to add an 8x12 room. Does that change that expansion to say, okay, you can't expand yours, but you're not increasing the liability because you already have an existing house out there that doesn't meet that standard? So this is where it's to say we have a hard hammer and we put it down. There's got to be some type of negotiation in between. So I understand the hard hammer and putting it down, but in life, reality doesn't always afford a hard hammer. That's, you know.
But the standards that are in 4B are already a compromise. Now you're saying they're compromised
So
standards.
someone already lives, so someone has a house out there and they want to put an addition on, they're not allowed to. And if you hold it hard to that standard, because the right of way in them roads aren't wide enough to accomplish this road standard.
Well, not only that, it'll make some lots unbuildable.
Some of them are already got built on, but now I can't put an addition on my house because, I mean, unless you change it and put that addition to go up into 1, to where you don't have to have that road standard. I mean, so now I got one of the applications actually has a house there. They want to tear it down and build a new house. The new house they're going to build is going to be a little bigger, but not a lot bigger, but it's going to be a whole brand new house, which puts you into 2, which says you got to build it to this standard. The right of way is not wide enough. I mean, these are applications that came into me in this past week. So this is a hard question.
So let's go specific, right? Because we're bouncing around a little bit, because I think John made an excellent point, which if the planning board wants to talk to first, because certainly another issue, inconsistency with the policy as it's written, John pointed out, between section 1 and section 2. So section 1 is basically an automatic issue of a building permit. It requires a signature of a select board because of the statutory requirements, but no hearing, no review by department heads, no review by the planning board. These are things like garages, interior renovations, things that decks won't have the impact. It seems like the biggest concern is like an accessory dwelling unit or a new house. An inconsistency with section 2 seems to be, like John said, if somebody's looking to put in a new room, add a room, a 3-season room, or if somebody's looking to tear down a house and rebuild the same house. So not necessarily adding volume to the room, not adding,
But Connor, I saw, here's stop it, but isn't that covered under section 1? Replacement of existing building? That's in section.
They change
the footprint.
So if they make it so there's any living space,
It's a good point.
one of them I actually got, they want to put a basement in and raise it up. So when they put that basement in, that basement is actually living space that's added because they got a walkout basement.
It's additional volume.
It's additional volume, but you're not changing the use or the amount of people out there.
The recommendation to the select board that I intend to make is let's move everything but a new ADU and a new house into section 1. So if somebody wants to build a room, they don't have to go through the whole process.
My only concern on that is the state made it so that everyone could have an ADU. So.
Any lot, they can get a building permit.
Right, which.
41 still stands in their way.
So you could say no to the building permit, so they could say no to the ADU.
ADU's got to be an existing structure, right?
No, it can be in a new structure. any building lot that can get a building permit, you have to allow the ADU.
Right.
Now, with that said, 674-41, that expansion of use, the selectmen have to authorize the building permit, whether it's an ADU or not. So,
But in this case, we could say you can't get a building.
correct.
So an ADU would have to be an existing space. Because if you're gonna put a new space, make it a building by this policy.
Correct.
But if it was, so let me,
But that same guy that wants to do the walkout basement, because he's got his house on piers, he can't do it either by this policy right now. And that's one of the applications that came in today.
And I think that's
That's the problems. One of the problems too is the right of way, upstream from him, so to speak. He may have no control of it. He may not be able to get a right of way of 18 feet.
But that's what we.
But that's the point. That's the point.
We've
You
always
can't build,
roads.
he's restricted to where he can't build it to that standard. This one just happens to be right on the corner of Golf Course Way, where Golf Course Way might be wide enough to where he can get the 16 and 2, but someone's gonna have to go out and look at it. But the other one I got is on Rocky Point, where the house is there. They want to tear it down and rebuild it. You go, Micah Point, going out to Rocky Point. I bet you there's not even 12 foot of right of way in some of them areas out there. Never mind a 16-foot road with 2-foot shoulders.
Right.
And that's why I think to accomplish the goals of access, I think there's an opportunity to say, hey, there's something different with somebody rebuilding a house or adding a room with somebody adding an ADU, potentially a couple more cars on the road, another family on the road, or adding an entirely new house on a vacant lot. And maybe if the select board is willing to say, yeah, don't go through any of this process. You're not required to make any improvements if you want to put a room to the house, but not add an ADU, then you don't have to make improvements. But if you're adding a house or if you're adding an ADU, then you've got to meet these requirements and be more stringent on those requirements for that.
And then we fall back to, can it be done on the road? Are we talking just in front of his property?
No, the whole access from class 5 in.
And then we're up against where, okay, there's one section where it's only 14 feet and he can't make that any wider. Is it a hard no?
I have a suggestion. How about as an alternative to the hard no? He has to put 10% of the construction cost into a road improvement.
I think.
So you do a big house, you put in 20 grand, 30, 40, whatever it is, into a road improvement thing. You do a small addition.
What if the right of way is not wide enough to make that standard? That's where the issue comes in.
You buy that land.
Wow.
Like, I think what he's alluding to is over time, the next one will put a little more in that fund. And then finally you get enough money to say to this guy, listen, we're going to pay for your expansion in front of your house. Will you give it to us?
I don't know if you've been out on these camp roads. The houses and the camps are so close together that there's no buying land to make it wide enough. The homes, you don't have the 20 foot between the homes on these existing roadways. And the guy already has a camp farther down or a house farther down. Now, if he has a vacant lot farther down, like on Caleb Island Road, they got a whole bunch of these little 8-acre lots that you couldn't get a septic on anyways. So they couldn't get a building permit. That's why you see people putting their campers and using them for 180 days because the regulations allow it. I mean, it's not a hard hammer, slam it down, because each road has its own situation. That's the point.
So is it a situation where if it's the new construction or ADU, part of the application is coming in with proposed road approval, not wait till the select board tells them they got to say, where's your road improvement proposal? What are you going to do for us? Then we can evaluate that says, okay, they're going to do 14 in this section. They got this neighbor to do 16.
So on that point, excellent point. That's another topic, right? Because right now we don't require them to tell us what they're going to do. And we don't, if they want it waived, we don't require them to tell us what they want waived. But in my opinion, it's important to decide what you're willing to consider before you give them the direction to apply for waiver. Because if the select board decides that we're not going to go below the 16, 2, and 2, and if you want a waiver from the subdivision regulations, know that your room for a waiver is from 16, 2, and 2 to the subdivision regulations.
Which is like 22 and 3.
You can only request a waiver somewhere in between there. If the select board's willing to consider waivers below this, then that is, that's something, and maybe the select board changes their policy and says 16, 2, and 2 is what's required. Forget the subdivision regulations, and if you want to go below that, a formal waiver process to go below that and consider anything.
So hypothetically, if they say their level is 16, 2, and 2, and you know you can't get that on, what's the process there? It's just an unbuildable lot?
Well, so as the policy is written right now, that would be the case. But the select board's practice has been to issue building permits. And John makes a good point that the practice of issuing building permits without requiring 16, 2, and 2 has led to incremental improvements for some of these camp roads, Bear Road, but I think there's
well, I'll say that I frankly, looking at this, if they actually followed the policy that's already in place, and I understand what you're saying, but I don't have a problem with the breakout between section 1 and section 2 as it exists today. If they just want to make some improvements or add a deck onto a house that already exists or put a shed out back, you know, you can get a building permit. But section 2 is really defined by, am I going to change the traffic, the nature of the building? I mean, you're talking about a new building, changing seasonally year round.
I'd move addition up, you know, so you can have an expansion, because some of those places are small and you get a big enough lot, you know, to add a family room. I think that's reasonable to move that up into an approved use. It's the spot where you can't upgrade the road. Is there legal ramifications that someone's going to come and say the town, you know?
The select board, and there's communities out there that through their authority, and I say communities, it is the recommendation of the New Hampshire Municipal Association to all municipalities that they do not issue building permits on Class 6 and private roads, period. Because they create so much headache for municipalities, period. And so what the advice of the Municipal Association is, bring a road up to a standard, accept it as a Class 5 road and move on, or don't do anything. So there's a lot of communities out there that through their authority of 674-41, the governing body doesn't issue any permit on Class 6 and private roads. I don't think anybody's saying that's what's right for Barrington, but the spectrum, there are other communities, Guilford's a local example, they don't do any process. They
Just sign the indemnification.
Yeah, they sign a waiver to be recorded at the registry and move on. No upgrades or requirements. So
674-41 requires the indemnification. That's required.
And that's where, I mean, I land more on that side of, you know, use your land as you see fit and sign the indemnification.
Yeah.
I think I'm over the middle ground. I still say, come forward with your plan to me. If you can't, here's a surcharge you gotta pay.
That's what
I
happens.
would charge them a surcharge.
Yeah,
What
but
happens to the actual
these
mess?
rules already, it says partial list of factors. It says that they will consider the factors, whether the applicant proposes to physically bring the relevant portion of the Class 6 private road, Class 5 standards. So that's supposed to be considered. And they're also, you know, it says up in the application, any other information selectmen may reasonably require, including but not limited to the location, condition, capacity of existing bridges, culverts, impact wetland, road grade, a plan for continued maintenance. So all of that is there. I would think that the only thing that you would need to do is be more explicit in the checklist, because the checklist doesn't explicitly require them to talk about, are they going to upgrade the road or not, and what the current conditions are.
Yep, and so that's another, and that has less to do, we talked about it a little bit, but that's another point we make with the select board, is that we intend to require as part of the application them to tell us what they're going to do.
Right.
How are you going to, and we have some applications where they've done a great job. They've gone out to a road construction contractor, have a proposal, they submit that to the town. But I think, as far as waiver, I'll just throw out an option and the planning board can weigh in. What if we set as the minimum standard, the 16, 2, and 2? So what's listed there in 4B, Roman numeral 1 through 5. So say that's the standard. The standard you have to meet for Class 6 and private road is this. If you do this, then you can expect the process to go like this, make your application will go. If you're going to request a waiver, you can request a waiver, but you have to be very specific. You have to specify what you're requesting a waiver from, what you're proposing as an alternative, why you're requesting a waiver, and the onus is on you to present that to staff, department heads, the planning board, and ultimately the select board to say, this is what I'm proposing. Almost like the zoning board, how the zoning board considers variances. It's specific. There's items that they have to supply in order to be considered, so that the waiver process is more specific. The standards are a little bit lower, the standards indicated in the policy, but the waiver process is more specific. Is that something that the planning board would support or recommend?
I agree with that, but I also would, if you're gonna if you're gonna ask for a waiver, I'll whack them with surcharge. To go to the road maker.
So I love that idea, Ron. A problem with that is the town can't hold those funds. So it would be required to be held by the road association. The problem with road associations is so many of them are informal and don't have the capacity to manage that properly. So I'd love to.
Let's go look at the alternative. Let's not put in a fund. You have to do road improvements up to 10%.
Oh, interesting.
Well, that's what they done in the past. In the past, that was what it was. Bring in 2 loads of gravel, a load of coal patch, regrade the road when you're done. That's the incremental improvements that they've done in the past that didn't meet the standard. That's how they've been operating.
So if you want a waiver, you have to at least put 10% of the bill of
Your construction cost.
That's unique.
Because if you can afford to build the house, you can afford to put something on the road.
Okay, so the other thing is gonna happen with this, so you go go a long ways down one of them roads, and you come in and say, here's what I want to waive and here's why. Does that mean they have to hire a surveyor and an engineer to lay out the whole road, show the widths, show the narrowness, show where the ditch lines are in order to say, I don't meet it because of this? I mean, where do you draw the line on what's required for them to prove it?
And so that's another section, right? That's another conversation, which that conversation is right now, we require them to do everything to make conversation. They have to have an approved septic. If they need variance, they need that approved. They need to have building plans, which is crazy because they could go through all that process, spend the thousands of dollars
and get denied.
Be told by the select board, your lot's unbuildable because you can't upgrade the road. So and this was John's idea, and it's a great one. They should have the opportunity to go through this process at the beginning, before they pay the surveyor, before they pay the septic design.
But they might have to pay for a road design.
But there is something that we're going to have to know something in order to, so if they're going to make the assertion that this road isn't wide enough or the costs are too expensive, then they're going to need to have something to support that as part of the waiver. Because that's, just like with the zoning board, you have to provide something. I don't think it needs to be a full survey of the road, but, hey, this is the existing condition, or having a contractor go out there. But let's go back to the minimum standard being 16, 2, and 2. I heard from Jamie and Ron, Andy, Jeff, Steve.
Yes, please. So as I sent the select board a while back, the copies from the fire code. So in order to be consistent with the fire code, that's a 20-foot travelable way for all fire access roads. So that would be the 16, 2, and 2. So to my mind,
Fire code
it's
does
not-
not apply to 1 and 2 family.
what's that?
Finished.
Go ahead, sorry.
Also, fire codes refer to a radius, turning radius. They are not very specific, but that might be something that this document should also refer to, about how tight the turns can be. Any amount of increase of livable space is an increase of liability because eventually, sooner or later, more people will live there, statistically speaking. What else did I want to say? It's been a while here. Road association required. So the language in the current Class 6 policy is encouraged. There really needs to be a road association. That is pretty important. And I do like Ron's idea about setting aside money proportional to the scale of the project to start making improvements. I'm not sure about how exactly that would be implemented, but that would at least be a step that would be fair and affordable.
The road association thing, we actually had an attorney weigh in on this when we originally did this policy. You cannot go back on someone's, when they purchase their property, they purchase it with certain rights and certain conditions. You cannot go back on them and put a condition on after the purchase of the sale. So
But what the policy does do, which we're not doing right now, is section 7. So section 7 of the policy indicates that you require a duly recorded instrument regarding road maintenance. So that's not the formal establishment of a road association. If somebody wants to comply with this policy, they have a document recorded in the registry that is a road maintenance agreement, presumably either with their road association or with their neighbors to say, hey, look, this is how we're going to maintain the road. Because as John mentioned earlier, it's not just about the construction of the road, it's about the maintenance of the road. A lot of times the problems are with maintenance, not necessarily construction. You can have a 14-foot road that if it's maintained, Micah Point's a great example. Micah Point's maintained really well, and it's generally okay that it's narrow. Swain Road is a little bit wider maybe, but it's maintained terribly. Generally.
Or not maintained.
Right.
Or not maintained at all. So, and Steve, to your point, while that doesn't have the weight of requiring a road association, after a while, we have these agreements. When we hear from a resident on a road where we have a duly agreement, we can say, hey, look at the registry. This agreement exists, and they can bring that to their neighbors. Now, it's not ours to enforce. It's not the registry's to enforce. It's still going to be between neighbors, but at least it's something. It's the same as how Bear River and Longshore Drive have been issuing liens on the properties of the people that haven't been paying the road dues. It's generally accepted if that was challenged in court, it would be questionable because of John's point about a road association. You kind of have to agree to that in the beginning. It's kind of hard to establish a road association unless literally everybody says we want to join this. Even a majority, the law is uncertain whether it has standing to issue liens and have them be enforceable. But you know what those liens do? When those people go to sell their property, guess what? Those liens get settled. Those liens aren't challenged.
Costs less to pay that than to go to court.
Exactly. And so the point is these duly recorded instruments might not be the legal coup de grace, but they're going to do something. They're going to be effective. And that's already in the policy. That doesn't have to change. We just have to make them do it. Right. You know? And what we can use is the subdivision regulations that the planning board, we have a variety of examples of road maintenance agreements. So they don't have to start from scratch. We can say, hey, pull from these. You know, the Bumford Road one is as simple as it can be. Some of the bigger subdivisions.
Getting a loan on a property.
The Bumford one, I don't think is a good example. You couldn't have a better person put a road together than the former highway
But the
superintendent.
maintenance agreement's one paragraph. It's very simple. That was my point.
But he
It's a simple
maintains it.
road maintenance agreement.
Right, but it's maintained by the former highway supervisor of the town.
But if you read the agreement just contemplates the bare minimum of what you need to say. Hey, we're gonna go in on this together. We're gonna make sure it's plowed. It doesn't talk about who does it or what level.
I mean, I think if road associations, if you don't have a road association, getting loans on properties, getting insurance is becoming more and more problematic. I mean, you really have to have them these days.
Okay, so I heard from Steve, and your point about, I think what Steve said about the fire code is the fire code doesn't apply, but the 16.2 and 2 meets a lot of the intent of the fire code.
Yeah, and I think Steve's thing is, he's talking about safety, life safety, so that should be our guiding principle is the fire, regardless of maybe the other requirements. You're talking about life safety, and so let's look to that document as to what those minimum requirements should be.
Well, the
Yeah.
state
And
exempted
liability.
that, but they also exempted out sprinklers. So if you go, the building codes and the fire codes are all for safety. The state of New Hampshire exempts a lot of stuff out of both of them codes because New Hampshire is a live free and die state.
Okay.
Or
I do
live
too.
free and die.
That's what I said.
You're right.
That's how it, if you look at how the building codes and stuff,
Yeah.
some of the stuff would, to me, makes no sense why they exempted it. If
Yeah.
you look at the safety in it. That's
No.
why I call it in die and not. But
Yeah. Right.
Okay, Steph, your thoughts about setting 16.2 as doing the standard and having a formal waiver process to go below that?
Well, I don't, I guess if you say we have standards, but the select board can have lower standards, but now we're going to establish a system on how we can get away with not even meeting the minimum standards. You have no minimum standard.
But that's what the proposed change is, Jeff. That's the point of the proposed change.
What's that? I know.
Is to reduce the floor. So there's no floor, but it's a specific process where they have to make a waiver. They have to request a waiver, and maybe part of the requirement is that if they're going to be waived below 16.2 and 2, they have to put the improvements into the road. However far that gets them.
I actually don't think that's a bad idea.
I don't think so either. I mean, it'd be generally.
Let the road association.
That they have to submit with the building permit.
widths. You can't.
Well, but
No,
it doesn't matter how
have to be
wide.
about
It
width.
just
It
says.
should be about improvement costs.
If they have to spend $10,000 on the road, maybe that's gravel, maybe that's paving the apron, maybe that's.
Over,
Right.
over ditches, whatever.
The ditches, cleaning out the ditches.
And if you do new construction, you bring an excavator in, it's not that big of a deal
Well, you'll burn through 10% of the cost pretty quickly having.
Well, it depends.
But it'll be.
If it's Long Shores and they want to build down by the end and it's a $10 million job, what are you gonna say? You gotta spend $1 million
No,
in
the
a
house
house to get your building
He's
permit?
saying
If
10%
you're
of
building
the,
a
your building
$500,000
cost.
house.
10% of the building cost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so if you build it.
The guy that's building that $200,000 home, he's gonna pay just 20 grand.
Right, yeah, you know,
I like
he doesn't have much, you
Yeah.
know, and,
If you're doing a sunroom, you're paying a grand.
right.
Oh, the concise answer to your question, Connor, is I like the current policy and, yeah, and just want it enforced.
Okay, and I guess what I'll say, I don't think the sitting select board is going to keep the minimum threshold at 16.2. I don't think the sitting select board is going to say no to building permit applications if they can't meet 16.2. And personal opinions are irrelevant, but the select board has the authority to do that. And so I think if, with that information, if we can improve the process, the 10%, it would be better than what the select board is doing now.
I agree.
Because the last one on Longshore Drive,
They
don't
didn't
have to do
require anything.
They didn't have to do anything.
The last probably 10 on Long Shores, they haven't required anything.
Yeah.
And I actually think the road associations would appreciate that more
Wow.
because it gives them something to go work with.
Just background, there's dispute right now between Berry River and Long Shores, and I was told the person that lives on Long Shores has bought his own grader, and they're gonna start grading Long Shores separately, and that association is gonna have some growing pains.
Which one, the Longshores? or the
Speaking of
Bear
that,
River?
It's all one association now,
Someone, you know,
and then someone on Long Shores didn't, which said
And we
about
can
the bottom,
encourage them
bought his own
to
grader.
use
He's gonna
those
start
funds in
maintaining
conjunction
roads,
with.
and he's only gonna
I
maintain.
think you could
Sure.
try to do the
Yeah.
work to the
Yep.
existing road.
Which I could understand.
The only, yeah, if they feel that's, because some of them are viable.
Right, I think.
You don't want to give it to a corrupt or mismanaged.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a good point. So is the general consensus of the board is that if we, the requirement of 16.2, the 10%, a waiver to be considered with 10%.
That's what
Presumably,
I-
they still
that's-
have to demonstrate the need
That's
for
the
a waiver.
background.
The right of way.
That's what I think is the big part.
Yeah.
Forcing them to demonstrate a need, well, I mean, I get you, it goes against my base principles, but, you know, things we're taking rights.
But I think the counterpoint, Jamie, that resonates with me.
I agree.
We don't often have the ability to improve circumstances if somebody isn't going to take it upon themselves to improve circumstances. And everything that the planning board does in requiring applicants at any level to do something is we're exercising the limited authority we do have. I don't necessarily think our authority should be expanded. You know, I don't think we need more authority to restrict property rights. I think we have the authority that we do have. We need to exercise it consistently, specifically with specific goals. Parts of it that I don't think.
So one of the pieces I would like to make sure is brought up that was a contentious component that we discussed from a select board end is that no current select board has the authority to restrict or inhibit the decisions made by the next select board after it. So we could do this and the next select board coming in could say, go pound sand, I don't agree with any of this. So when I look at this, the way to do it is you want to do it in a way that the next select board could look at it and buy into it and say, hey, yeah, I think that's the process. It might not be a perfect process, but it's a process that moves it forward, which is why I actually like the idea that Ron's proposing, was saying 10% of your costs goes to it, because you're more inclined to get any select board, whether it's a conservative select board or a very liberal select board, to buy into that and say, yeah, that's very reasonable and very doable.
So I guess that begs the question as far as a waiver, that if is it then, instead of a waiver, is it just either or? Either make the road 16.2 or invest 10%. And the investment of 10% is at the recommendation that the road agent and the fire chief and the police chief get to weigh in on how that 10% is spent. Yes,
It brings up
we need
John's point about how do you survey the whole road to prove where and what is
Right.
So maybe
deficient.
it's not a waiver process, it's just you do.
Well,
one or
your
the other.
association would know where the work needs.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
I don't.
No, I'm saying as far as bringing the road
If
up
it's
to
a viable road
standards.
association, I want the money to go to the viable road association. I don't want the money to go to the town to roll into Baxter Lane. start doing.
They
Town
can't,
can't.
town
What I was
legally.
saying is that
We're not
use the resources that we have of the road agent, who's an expert, subject matter expert in road construction, to advise how that 10%. So, hey, it'd be best, just like he makes his recommendations now, and maybe they're not requirements, but hey, you'd be well suited to do X, Y, and Z.
Because the downside is, okay, I gotta spend 10%, it's $10,000. And I just go and start dumping truckloads of dirt along the road wherever I see fit, and I'm filling in wetlands, I'm, overflowing someone's culvert. That's not gonna happen.
Well, that brings up a question that in my mind, listen to this is, so we've already established that a lot of these road associations are non-functional. So even if you make this requirement, how's that money going to get spent? Who's going to make the decisions? If in fact the road association is non-functional.
Yeah, from what I think would work, it would still have to be the individual property owner. We can encourage them to work with the road association if one exists, but we couldn't require it because how are we going to measure if it's a viable or properly established road?
Well, I think that I like your idea of the 10% being I think they should be approved by the road agent and or the road association if it's viable, one or the other.
But how do we determine if it's viable?
That's the sticky.
Well,
If
viable.
Road association is viable.
So,
if it's active and manual.
We don't know if it's properly established.
or mismanaged.
In the past, that bit about a couple of truckloads of gravel and coal patch if it's needed on slopes and stuff like that, that's dictated. It was before, this is how it was done before. The road agent says, at this point, we need a load of gravel, we need another load of gravel there, we need a coal patch on this hill, and that's what people did, and it was specific to, here's what you're gonna do to fix this road. Over time, that's gone away.
I agree with you, John, on that, but
But the percentage,
too. And you know what I mean? Our road, we have a plan.
Right.
We have a capital plan going forward, stuff we want to do. And I would like the stuff to be spent in alliance with that plan.
Right. But as well versed as you may be, you may have no idea on road construction, and you may just be putting money into, wetlands or ditches.
some groups are way better knowing what they need. I 100% agree.
Saying that's not.
But so what about this? You have three options as an applicant, right? You meet the 16.2 and 2, you commit to investing 10% before you get your certificate of occupancy, or you submit a waiver. Because maybe there's a road at the beginning of a private road that they want to put a new house on, a $500,000 house, and we're going to say they have to spend $50,000 on a road and they're 50 feet from the class 5 road. And maybe the select board would consider a waiver for that. So the waiver process is that you don't want to do it.
Then the guy puts a mobile home on 2 miles in, he's only got to give you $1,000.
I mean, because if it's me and I'm building a house, I'm just gonna pave the section in front of my house. So it's, my driveway's paved and I got a T paved at the end and I'm done.
But it's still an improvement.
But that's where the input of the road agent fire chief comes in, right? Because the road agent could look at that and say the best way to spend your $10,000 is bring in 10 loads of gravel, have it graded, clear the ditch line. And those are the requirements that go in there.
And that's.
Okay, so I think we're clear on there. Section 1, Section 2. So maybe if the recommendation is that way, maybe nothing needs to move in Section 1, Section 2.
Right.
I'm okay with the road agent being in charge, but I would like him to consult, if possible, with the road association. And I think that's important.
So that scenario I had about the guy jacking his house up and having a walkout basement, he's doubling the size of his house. He's got to do the whole thing with the road, but
I think he should be exempt.
That's the point I'm trying to
I
get
think he
to.
should be exempt.
So,
Because you're on footings, you're trying to waterproof, if you bought a camp, if it's a seasonal, if he's year round and he's just putting a foundation on, if it's a seasonal conversion, that's a different story.
they've been living there.
Yeah, so that's a different story. A seasonal conversion with a foundation, but if you're just improving your property by putting a foundation under it, I don't think that should trigger it.
But
it's not worded as footprint. Why don't we just change the wording to say within the same footprint? That way.
Because it says here.
It already says
Issues
that.
that add volume to an existing
No, that's
building.
what I'm saying.
So if they do a second
No,
floor.
I understand.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we just change so Section 1 reads, alterations.
It already says that. It says improvements or replacement and the footprint remains the same. So that already covers that.
But it says use volume.
It says volume and, meaning it applies to both. If it said volume or, then you could pick one or the other.
So we just take volume. We just remove volume.
But to me, when you put in a foundation, in, you're probably going from a season place to a year-round.
And if that's the case, then that triggers
Most of
something
the time,
else.
if someone's moving it up, he's going year-round.
think a lot of these.
I don't think I want to give him a waiver for that. He's going year round, skipping it part-time.
Well, yeah, because now he's using it year round, where before it was just in the summer.
Yeah.
And it's the winter maintenance that plugs the road up and creates a
Well, we
situation.
That's change of
know.
use. That's
I don't think
change
we
of
write a
use.
Policy, so it only applies to people going from season.
Well, that's
Yeah, I
why-
don't
no,
think you
that's
could
why
do
Michael-
that. I think you would end up in a legal battle that would be like,
But that's not.
Because the town doesn't define seasonal.
right.
The only one that does is the state, and that has to do with their septic system.
Well, how about this, right? So if we go back to the three options, 16, 2 and 2, 10%, or request a waiver. So in this case, they could request a waiver and say, look, I'm really increasing the volume, but I'm just adding a foundation. So I'm already living there year round, and that's the basis, that's the grounds for a waiver. So there's still a door, which I think should be purposely narrow, but there's still a door for those unique circumstances, because you don't write the.
Or
policy
just
for
change
every-
that little thing and take the word volume out. And just do the
No,
same.
because I think there's reasons we want volume in there.
Yeah, I don't want volume in there.
I want
I mean, if
volume.
you've got it, I know, but you want to take away from everybody. And and that's fine. That's your
Yeah, but
opinion.
I'm on the road this applies to. So-
Right. and
Me
you
too,
don't
you're
want-
not
I
alone.
know.
But I still don't
when
agree
my-
with you.
When my mother lived on the beach, everybody wanted to be the last one to build the McMansion, and then you can't do it. I'm here, I did it, I don't want you to do it. I think if you've got a 600 square foot cottage and you need to put a second floor in there, you're not expanding the use where you're bringing in 3 more kids and you know.
A counterpoint, I think the point Ron's making is you are, because if it's a camp that you're only at a few weeks of the year, and you're adding that second story so you can be there year round, you're doing just that.
And that's why
But you
number
know
2,
what?
conversion of a seasonal dwelling.
But that one there is,
I'll leave
Andy
those
said,
two.
that's a legal liability. I wouldn't,
How
even
do
if,
we know?
even if they're staying there, even if they only use it in the summer, for you to say that building only has seasonal use and that's all you qualify for, I think you're,
I think that's problematic.
yeah, very
I would
problematic.
not want to go down that road.
I mean, that whole thing about the seasonal thing should almost come out of here, because I think it actually gives, I think it's gonna put the town in a liability issue.
But it's always been there.
Wow.
I mean, how
We
many,
haven't enforced it, that's the problem.
who comes in and
No,
asks?
well, it's
Well,
been
they
here
come in and
since
get a building permit.
2015.
Well, believe it or not, a couple of years ago, or let's say 4 years ago, I had people on the lake that wanted to fix their deck because it was rotten and unsafe. They had to go through the whole process. By the time they got through the whole process, the summer was over. They had to use their deck unsafe all summer. So I got the selectmen to change it to include decks. And I tried to get them to include garages, and I was told no, because they might damage the road when they do construction work, and we want to be able to have the road graded afterwards. But then I had a whole bunch of them come in, they built a house a year later or 2 years later, they're coming and getting a permit for a garage. The identification was already signed, so the selectmen were like, so why are they coming back for the garage? Because you guys wouldn't approve the garage as part of this thing before. So then that got changed again. So this policy is not the same policy that was originally written. It's been changed 3 or 4 times.
Right, but when someone comes in for a building permit to, and there's no identification that it's a seasonal dwelling, when they come in to say that they're.
Oh, this is their policy. You read 67441, you know what it says? For an erection of a building. So if you go strictly on that, if there's already a building there and they're doing stuff, technically they don't have to apply by 67441. It's the selectman policy that makes them have to apply by this, not the RSA.
So Jamie, if there's a waiver process for those extended, so if we're not able to use section 2, number 2, about seasonal, because there's a way for us to know. And if we leave the waiver process open, so in circumstances like the foundation, we make it clear that the purpose for the waiver process is that so you can come forward and say, look, I'm not expanding the use, I'm not adding family members, I'm not going from seasonal to non, and provide some evidence to support that. And then the select board has the authority, which they already have, but with a formal process to waive any requirements, the 10% or otherwise.
Hey, Carol,
Well-
have you dealt with this issue in your work and with other towns?
Quite a lot, yes, and it's really complicated. I think you've already mentioned a lot of the issues that towns deal with, and Connor has as well, that many towns just simply say no because it is complicated. There are some I've seen that will have regulations that include consideration of the distance of the driveway from the end of a class 5 road, for example, but you know, that also can get complicated. I think for me, the biggest issue with this. I mean, standards are fine and waivers of liability, even though they don't protect the town against a third party. That's another issue with these. But the biggest issue I see, and I don't have a solution to it, is the hopscotching that happens. And I think that tonight's example of the building permit that you discussed earlier, there are already, from looking at the tax map, 3 houses that use that piece of road that this new person would like to use. So how do you equitably divide this up if people are already there? You can't reach back and make the existing ones pay for something for, further improvement. So that's an issue. I don't have an answer for it, but I see that as a big problem, and it really complicates, I think, all of the other issues that you're trying to deal with.
And to feed off of that, if they do an upgrade to the road and it doesn't make it perfect, it's actually making it safer for all the people that already live out there. That's called that incremental upgrade. It's like they're actually making things better, even if they're not making it perfect.
Push the 10%. That's the idea of the night, Ron. You should.
Hold on.
Yeah, you get the first pin. You get the first pin. Okay, so I think I've got
A patch.
patch. So I think I have enough to formulate an opinion. I just want to make sure that I caught everything. So I think the consent is to leave section 1 and section 2 alone and handle anything in section 2 that shouldn't be waived. And consider waivers before variances, septic plans. They shouldn't cost a lot. Get a waiver to just do your the 10% of the construction cost, so there's essentially going to be 3 options. Formal waiver, construction cost. Highly recommended that they work with the association, and the 16.2. I mentioned the permit for work on Class 6 road. Oh, bonding was the other thing. We have in our policy that we can require them to bond the work that they're doing, and sometimes we might want to do that.
On the Class 6
On the Class 6 road. I think my recommendation to the select board is going to have their proposed work submitted to the town's engineer for a recommendation about bonding. Maybe they'll say, hey, look, there's not really anything they can screw up. If they stop at any point in this process, it'll still be better, so you don't need to bond it.
Because I don't want, you're putting gravel down. I don't want you to do that going into the winter time. It's going to be plowed away. Do the springtime.
Well, you're not going to plow gravel away.
You put gravel down, and the plow's going to plow.
Depends on how compacted it gets and used before.
If you're putting three-quarter road grade, you're not plowing it away.
That's it. Ron makes a good point. If the best time to do the improvements that we're talking about are
springtime,
later down the road, giving them the opportunity to bond the work where they still get their CO, but they have to do the work. What I'm talking about is an insurance bond, so that if they stop midway through the project. So the same instrument, but for different reasons. Do you understand the difference, I guess? So, yeah, so in either case, I think having CMA, having the town's engineer review the work, and maybe CMA says, yeah, have them bond it and do this in the spring, because that's better.
So now you're going to make the applicant pay for CMA to review the project?
I would have the town pay for it.
The town?
I don't think it's going to be a tremendous review. It's just an opinion on bonding.
You're just looking for just to press the board bonding?
No,
I got a funny
Only on
feeling
the
that's
Class
gonna
6
be-
roads, because you can't apply that on private road. The town has authority.
We can move on from that. I don't think we need to get into the weeds on that one. Making the policy requirements more specific. The policy as it's written requires that each department had sign off before the CO is issued. So inspect and sign off. So I think that's a good way to check them out if it worked. And we already talked about the duly recorded instrument regarding road maintenance, which I think is going to be awesome too. And the last thing, which we talked about, which I'm guessing there's support for, but allowing them to come through before they have everything, before they have their septic and everything like that, so that they can know if their lots are open. Thank you.
Hey, one last question. On the back of the checklist, it talks about the appeal, so that if the Board of Selectmen denies a building permit, that it says you can appeal to the ZBA. Is that by state statute, or is that something we did?
The state statutes, they have a right to appeal your decision, my decision, the selectman decision.
Wait, are you saying 674-41 says that they can?
Any decision made by the select board can be appealed to the ZBA, just like any decision made by the planning board.
Any decision made pursuant to 674-41? I mean, you can't appeal any decisions that were based on the zoning board. That's.
With the land use stuff, I'm pretty sure. You have to look on 674-41. Most land use stuff has a right to be appealed. Even the selectman decision has a right to be appealed.
Yeah, but in the case of the planning board, it doesn't go to the ZBA, it goes to Superior Court.
That law changed. Remember, there's not, remember that law they put in? Nowadays, there's a board you can go to.
Yeah, there's a building. On the stuff with me, they can choose to go there instead of.
Remember that? Remember that thing they want us to wait in on the law change? Remember
Yeah,
that? John?
Yeah.
So it's a new process.
But I'm saying yeah, but it doesn't go to another board internally in the town, other than the only thing that goes to the select board is if we don't act on an application in a timely manner. But they don't have the ability, there isn't another board in town that gets to hear an appeal of a decision that we made. It's external to the town.
I just did a keyword search in 674-41 for zoning board, and there's nothing in the statute that allows you to appeal to the zoning board.
Yeah, that seems odd to me.
Zoning board can grant relief because they did that on the things on the island lots too. That's a whole thing that we went through when we did those things on the island lots, and I got that from the town's attorney.
So well, Connor, I suggest you look at that too, because that doesn't seem right to me. Something's off about that.
But I think there are two different things. I think both of those things can be true, because I think the select board, with their authority of 674-41, can say no, and I don't think an applicant can go get a yes from the zoning board, because the community.
This would imply that you could.
No, what John's saying.
Oh no, the policy. He's talking about the policy. The policy gives him the right.
Yeah, and so I guess that is in the policy, but what John was saying is it has to be in the policy. I don't know that it has to be in the policy.
Yeah, this, because I'm looking at it, it says any such decision made in this connection by the zoning board of adjustment shall be in writing together with the reasons for the decision. It shall be subject to review in the manner described in RSA 677. So this says the zoning board could reverse the decision.
And I think that's good.
I think we need to look at 677 and see what it actually says.
Yeah,
even if it's not required by statute, I think it's a good idea to have a local appeal for the decision of the select board. Yeah.
All right, well, I just hadn't seen that in any other context, is why I was asking.
Yep.
Connor, your basic inclination of making sure the select board is actually following their policy is, I'm all for that. That would be great. What's on paper should be what happens.
And I think Andy makes a great point about binding the hands of a future board. But I think the reason that the select board has developed and consistently reviews policies is to kind of lay the groundwork for future boards to have some consistency. So every time a new board comes in, it's not a completely different political whim. The first step should be updating the policy and then changing it, because I think consistency is best for everybody. Change needs to happen, make change happen.
But regardless of what the policy is, it's still, I agree that you might as well throw it in the trash if you're not going to enforce it.
Yep, whole purpose of this process, I am sincerely appreciative of the planning board for spending, almost an hour, I guess, getting into the weeds of that. And I hope that the select board, as Andy and I will articulate on the 24th, will take your advice under.
I'm going to vehemently fight it all. No.
So 677
That's
says
true, yeah.
the appeal, if it's a zoning related decision, goes to the zoning board. So if it's a zoning related decision, so
Yeah,
that's not a zoning related decision because it's not in zoning. So therefore it's not a
No.
zoning related
building
decision. So,
permits are not in zoning, so yeah, I don't see how that applies.
well, building permits are, but
Yeah,
class 6 and private roads
It's
aren't.
definitely.
Oh,
in
yeah,
some-
okay, that's what I meant to say, sorry.
Even if it's not required in statute,
Showing
you
some
can
building
afford
permit.
the applicant the ability to appeal consistent with 677.
I think that would be appropriate because we're talking about the issuance of a building permit because of a class 6 private road. So in the issuance of a building permit is the zoning component.
Actually, I think in zoning, it says if you're building on a class 6 or private road, you have to go through the policy. So therefore, it would be a zoning decision, which would kick it back to them because of this, because it's written in zoning.
Oh, yeah, I'll ask.
Good idea, because clearly the examples of the selectmen going rogue.
Nobody knows this.
The existing one?
I mean, I think what we've really gathered out of this is Jeff is better left at home because Ron is taking right over it. being the, authority here.
He wants to turn it into Massachusetts.
I
but I'm
know.
beyond that.
Right.
Charge him for it.
I'm okay with
They
that.
have to adjourn.
All right, February 1st, right? Next
Yeah.
meeting?
Motion to adjourn.
All right, all in favor?
All right.
In a couple weeks. Thank you.
By leaving.
Put a stinger in there.
All right.
Yeah.
Here.